They handed out 11 relics in the Great Hall that morning, and the last one went to me because nobody else in the room would touch it. Sir Gethin Dask got a sword that burns without fuel. I got a crate that had been sitting in a chancery cellar for 40 years, and the man who signed my posting was already smiling before I reached the steps. My name is Emmerich Vane. I was 19. I was a junior scribe of the petition registry, and by law my word was not a petition because I had no seal, and a seal cost more than my whole street earned in a year. The herald read the names in order of blood. 200 people stood under the banners in clean linen and watched each relic come up the steps on a cushion. A spear that finds water, a crown that keeps a man from lying, a cloak nobody could see through. Every one of them went to a house with land, and every house clapped for itself. I stood at the end of the line with ink on my knuckles, because I had been copying tenancy rolls until an hour before, and nobody had told me to change my coat. The herald reached the bottom of his page. He said, "Sir Gethin Dask, the Blade of Embers," and the hall made a noise like a market when a cart tips over. Dask was 26, and he took the sword like a drink somebody else had paid for. He held it up. The edge went orange in the middle, and the front row leaned back. Then the herald said Emmerich Vane, junior scribe, 1 complaint box, and 2 porters carried a crate up the steps and set it down at my feet. The lid was warped. There was a slot cut in the top, the wood was gray with cellar damp, and one corner had been chewed by something with teeth. I want to be honest about what I did in that moment, because it matters later. I did nothing. 200 faces turned to me and my voice went out like a pinched wick. That is not nerves. That is how my throat works. In a room, when eyes come at me, the sound stops at the back of my mouth, and all that comes out is air. So I stood there and caught myself grading the herald's handwriting on the relic list instead of listening to the laughing, because that is the other thing my head does when it wants to be somewhere else. Then Das came down 2 steps and kicked the crate off the dais. It went over the edge, and it took me with it, because I had my hand on the lid like an idiot who has never been kicked before. I went down the stone stairs on my shoulder and my hip, and the lid came off, and I ended up on the flags with the box under my chest and one arm out. I got my burned side under me and reached for the edge to drag the box back up the step, and Dask put the blade of embers flat on the wood right beside my fingers and left it there. I did not see the blade come down. I felt the heat, then the smell of my own skin, and then I was holding my palm against my coat and counting to keep quiet. The wood hissed like fat in a pan. There is a black scar across that lid to this day, and part of it is the shape of my thumb, because I did not let go fast enough to be sensible about it. He lifted the sword off the lid and looked around the hall to make sure of his audience. Then he said, "Write it down, scribe. Maybe the world will file a complaint about you." Somebody in the 3rd row threw an apple core through the slot in the top while my hand was still shaking, and that got a bigger laugh than the sword had. And here's the part that tells you what I am. Face down on the floor, palm burned. I reached for the box first and my coat second. I heard myself say thank you for the return of the item in exactly the voice I use for filing, and the laugh went round again. Then the hall went polite all at once, the way a room does when the money in it stands up. The Lord Chancellor was on his feet, and he was applauding me. Oral Mott was 63, and he clapped as a man claps for a child's recital. He said, "Keeper of the box," a useful posting for a careful young man. He put a paper in my burned hand himself. "Keeper of the complaint box, quarters and duty in the lower registry, effective from the date below." I read the date on it before I read the courtesy, because dates are my trade and my hands go to them without asking me first. 11 years of tenancy rolls will do that to a person. The posting was signed yesterday, before the ceremony, before the herald opened his page. Whatever the hall thought it had just watched, my exile had been drafted the day before, and nobody in that room noticed except the clerk holding it. I did not say that either. I folded it and put it in my sleeve, and I thought about the lower registry, which is 2 rooms below street level with no stove in them. That is what the posting meant once you stripped the courtesy off it. 2 rooms below the street, a stone floor, no stove in either of them, and 6 weeks left before the first frost. 2 porters carried the relic out for the winners. Nobody carried mine. I took it down myself with one arm around it and my burned hand in my sleeve, and it weighed as much as a full water barrel. The lower registry smelled of wet paper and cold ash. Oda Brill was already there with a lamp, and she had put a stool by the desk before I arrived, which I only understood much later. She was 59. She had been the archivist longer than I had been alive, and she had a way of looking at the thing that was about to happen instead of at the person in front of her. She did not ask about my hand, and she did not ask about the ceremony, which I found strange at the time. She looked at the crate on the floor, and she said, "Open it." There were 3 papers inside. Not blank, 3 folded papers with handwriting on them sitting in a crate that had been buried in a cellar for 40 years. The first was a request about a broken gutter on Cobb Lane. The second was 6 lines about a bridge toll. The third was a single crooked sentence about water. Every one of them was dated in the corner in a different hand. The gutter on Cobb Lane was 4 days old. The bridge toll was 5. The single crooked sentence about water was 6. I asked how a sealed cellar box collects fresh complaints, and Oda did not answer that. She said read 1 and see, then count the days on the others. Then she lit a candle, set it by my elbow, and went up the stairs like a woman who had waited 40 years to hear a match strike in that room. I want you to notice what I did not have. No voice in a crowd, no seal, no rank above a stable hand, 1 burned hand, and 3 pieces of paper. What I did have was 11 years of the register, and the register is not a book. It is 900 volumes of who owes what to whom, and where every drain in the city runs. So, I did the only thing I have ever been good at. Before I read 1 word of it out loud, I took it upstairs to the ward volumes, and I checked whether it was actually true. The third paper said the water in our well is bad, and it made my brother sick. It was signed Nessa Quill, Tannery Row, and she had spelled brother with 2 letters wrong. Bad water is not a fact. It is a complaint about a feeling. So I went up for the ward volume, and I put the lamp on the map of Tannery Row. Row of 40 houses. 1 public well, dug in the rain before last. Tannery yards along the top of the slope, 6 of them, licensed. And above the well, on the same slope, a sluice that carries the tanning pit's runoff down toward the old ditch. Cut in 9 years ago. Repaired twice. Never moved. The lime, the hair, the fat, and the bark liquor all go down that sluice, and the sluice runs above her well, and the ground between them is sand. So there was nothing bad about her water in the way she had written it. Her water was 6 licensed tanneries and a 9-year-old sluice cut across sand above a public well. I had it in 1 page of cross-checking, and I wanted so badly to fix her sentence for her that my hand cramped on the pen. I did not touch her page. That is the reason any of this ever worked. So let me put it as plainly as I can, because everybody gets it wrong when they hear about the box for the first time. The box does not act on my words. It never has. It acts on what the wronged person wrote with their own hand, and only if the thing they wrote is true in substance. I did not know that rule yet in a form I could recite. I knew it the way you know a lock. I had tried to write my own complaint about Dask in the cellar, and the paper came out of that box blank. So, a corrected sentence in my handwriting was worth exactly nothing, no matter how right it was. The words had to be hers in her hand, or the box would sit there like the crate it is. It was the middle of the night, and Tannery Row is a mile downhill, and my hip was already going stiff from the stairs. I went anyway. The street smelled of hides and lime, which is a smell that gets into your teeth. A dog followed me for 2 lanes with real professional interest. Nessa Quill was 12, up on a stool at a cold hearth, boiling well water in a cracked pot because somebody had told her that helped. It does not help with lime. Her brother Tobin was 9 and asleep on the bench with his knees up, and his breathing had a whistle in it that I noticed and did not think about, which I will pay for later. She did not ask who I was. She asked whether I had come about the paper, which tells you how often anyone had come about anything. I said, write it again. Not bad water. Write the sluice above your well and write what it puts in there. And write that you can smell the lime in the pot. She asked why I could not just do it, and I said because I cannot write it for you. It is your grievance. My hand on it makes it nothing. She looked at me for about 3 seconds, and she was deciding whether I was a lunatic. And then she decided that being a lunatic did not make me wrong. She wrote it, slowly, badly, tongue out, with the pen I had in my sleeve, and she spelled sluice 3 different ways in 4 lines. Tobin woke up and asked if the box brought cake. I told him no, because the box only acts on a wrong already done to the person writing, and cake is not a wrong. He said not having cake was a wrong already done to him, and Nessa told him to be quiet. I wrote that exchange down later. It is still the best argument anyone has made against me. Then I read her 4 lines out loud in her own doorway, with the door open and the lime smell coming off the slope, because I needed to hear my voice work at least once that day. Nothing happened for 1 breath, and I remember thinking that this was going to be the second humiliation of the day. Then the sound came up the slope, and it was not water, it was stone. 6 paving slabs came out of the yard next door with a crack like a tree going over, and the sluice above the well closed, not blocked, closed, in stone, as if it had been built that way in the rain before last. The lime run went sideways into a new channel of hard gray slab that carried it away downhill past the houses, and it fitted the slope so well that a mason would have argued it was old work. Then, The seventh slab came out of the neighbor's yard, and the last of the channel closed with it. And the neighbor came out into the lane in his shirt. He stood there in his shirt with a lamp, looking at a flat patch of dirt where 7 slabs had been an hour earlier, and he asked the only sensible question available. He said, "Where did my yard go?" And there it was, in the first minute of the first thing I ever did with that box. A clean well for 40 families, and 7 paving stones missing from a man who never asked for any of it. I did not know the rule yet. I learned it standing in that lane at 2 in the morning. The box takes what it needs from the nearest suitable place, and the nearest suitable place always belongs to somebody. I offered to file his complaint about it, and I meant it. And I still think it was the correct offer. He told me to get off his lane before he found something to hit me with, which was fair. Nessa was already at the well with the pot. The first bucket came up and she did not put a rag over the top of it because there was nothing to strain. She drank it. Then she gave the rest to Tobin, and he drank it in one go and asked for more, and she filled it again without arguing, which, for her, is affection. 40 families use that well. By the next evening, every one of them had drunk out of it without a cloth, and 2 of the tanners had come down to look at the new channel and gone away angry, which I will hear about later. But the thing that landed on me happened in the lane. A woman leaned out of the next doorway and asked who did it and where the Lord was who did it. And Nessa put the bucket down on the stones and pointed at me with a wet hand and said, "Emmerich Vane read it, not a lord. Him." That was the first time anybody said my name out loud in front of other people, and it was a 12-year-old on Tannery Row at 2 in the morning, and it was not in the hall where 200 people had watched me burn. I stood in that lane holding my own burned hand against my coat, and I could not have told you which part of my chest hurt, and I did not trust myself to try to say anything back to her. Then I did the thing that nobody claps for. I went back to the neighbor's yard with the lamp, and I got down on my knees at the gap in the dirt, and I counted what the water had cost. 7 slabs, 1 yard belonging to a man named Halbert Pruitt, 1 well, 40 families, 6 tanneries still licensed, still running, and by morning extremely angry about a channel. I went back to the registry and I took a fresh ledger out of the cupboard, the kind we use for lock and key inventories, and I wrote on the first line what the water had cost and whose it was. 7 paving stones, yard of Halbert Pruitt, Tannery Row, taken in payment for the closing of the sluice above the public well. Read by me, written by Nessa Quill. I numbered the page 1 of 1 and dated it correctly, out of habit, for a book that nobody had asked me to keep, and no law required. That book is the only honest number in this kingdom now, and everything that happened to me afterward happened because I started it on that night instead of a year later. Then the far end of the lane went bright, and the light was moving, and it was coming down toward the well. Torches. 3 of them. Nobody brings 3 torches to fetch water at night. Dask does not walk anywhere quietly. He came with 2 men and a lamp and the sword still on his hip, and he came to enjoy himself, and he arrived at a well with a crowd around it. He came into the ring of light around the well, looked at the crowd, and decided to be witty at me. He said a bucket trick, and then he said it again louder for the crowd, and asked whether the chancery would be impressed by one. A tanner's wife wiped her hands on her apron and told him then, "Drink from the old one, sir. It is right there. Nobody is stopping you." There is a sound a crowd makes when the joke changes owners. It is not a laugh. It is quieter than a laugh, and it lasts longer. Dask put his hand on the hilt. Nobody moved back. Somebody at the back of the crowd said, "Let him try the water," and somebody else laughed properly. He told me the chancellor would hear about this. Then he left with his lamp, and I stood there with a burned hand and 40 families, and no idea that he had just told me the truth. Oda Brill was still on the registry stairs when I got back, hours after she should have gone home, with the lamp turned down low. She was not looking at me. She was looking at the crate. She waited until I had put the ledger down on the desk, and then she said the thing she had come back for. She said, "You read one. Now count the days on the others. Cobb Lane, 4 days when I found it, 5 by then. The bridge toll, 5 when I found it, 6 by then." The water had been 6 and the water was gone now because I had read it. I asked her what happens on the 7th day, and she did not soften it, and she did not look away either. She gave me the sentence I still hear in my sleep on bad nights. She said unread, "It happens anyway. On the 7th day, in the crudest way the words allow." Then she said it a second time, slower, so that I could not decide later that I had misheard it. I asked what crudest means, and she said it means nobody chooses where the payment comes from. Not the writer, not you. Whatever is nearest. So think about what that is. It is not a rule about feelings. It means somebody's wall, on a day nobody expected, because a paper sat in a box too long. I asked if there was a form for requesting an extension. I was not entirely joking. She did not laugh, and that told me everything about the next 6 years. I sat down with the lamp and did the only arithmetic that mattered in that room. The gutter on Cobb Lane had 3 days left on it. The bridge toll paper had 2. I put the gutter paper aside because a gutter is a gutter, and I took the 6 lines about the bridge toll and set them under the candle. It was a toll dispute out of Taro Ford, signed by a farmer, in the hand of a man who presses too hard with the nib. 6 lines. Clear enough that I did not think it needed the register. That was the mistake. Not a stupid mistake. A tired one. At 4 in the morning, with a fuse of 2 days on the paper, and a job of 2 days in checking it properly, and only one of those 2 days available. So at about 4 in the morning, with a burned hand and 2 days of fuse and 2 days of checking to do, I chose the fuse over the checking. I read the 6 lines out loud. The bridge toll is robbery. That is what the farmer wrote. And that is what I said. And I said it in the voice I use for reading a docket, as if the words were mine to be careful with. I heard my own voice say robbery, and then, from a long way outside the city wall, I heard a sound I could not place at all. The writer came at dawn, and he did not knock. He came down the registry stairs 2 at a time and stood in the doorway of a room with no stove in it, breathing hard, looking for somebody more important than me. I was the only one there. I had a candle stub, a burned hand wrapped in a strip of my own shirt, and a ledger with 1 line in it, and I was still holding the paper I had read 4 hours earlier. He asked whether the keeper of the box was in. I said I was the keeper of the box. He looked at me the way people look at a coin they suspect is tin. Then he said the sentence that took the next 2 days of my life. He said there is no toll now. There is no bridge either. I asked him to say it again. He said the bridge at Taro Ford is gone. Not broken, not burned. Gone, down to the water, with the 2 stone piers standing in the river like teeth. Here is what a farmer had written, in 6 lines, in a hand that presses too hard with the nib. The bridge toll is robbery. That was the whole grievance. That was true, and I had read it at 4 in the small hours without checking it. I had expected the toll to go. I had pictured a lawful 2 coins instead of 10, and a collector with nothing left to steal, and myself being quietly clever about it. What went was the thing the words were attached to. No bridge, no toll. The box does not read intentions. It reads letters, in order, exactly as written. And it does not care what you meant. I got that lesson in the first 4 seconds of that conversation, standing in a doorway with a wet rider in front of me, and I have never once forgotten it since, or needed to be told it twice. The rider wanted somebody punished, and I could see he had decided it would be me. I asked where the stone went, and he said what stone. That was the question, though. A bridge is about 900 tons of dressed stone. It does not vanish out of the world. It gets spent. And I already knew, because I had heard it happen on the slope above Tannery Row at the small hours of the morning, and I had called it a channel and gone to bed pleased with myself. I went up the lane before I put my coat on properly. The new stonework beside Nessa's well was still cold and wet with dew, and it ran 200 paces down the hill in a clean gray line. I got on my knees on it and looked at the joints, dressed faces, weathered edges, iron cramp holes filled with lead, the old way, the way nobody has paid for in 60 years. There was a parapet stone in it with a mason's mark cut in the corner, and a groove worn across the top of it where a rope has rubbed for 2 generations of carts. I sat back on my heels in the middle of that lane and said it out loud to nobody. This is the parapet. There is a new lane by that well, and I am standing on the crossing. Here is the part that shames me, and I will not dress it up. My first feeling was not horror. It was that the masonry was beautiful, and the fit of it was better than any city work I had ever seen. Then my head did the arithmetic, and the horror arrived on time. 40 families on this row now drink clean water. 6 villages on the other side of that river cannot reach their mill. The clean well I was proud of is made of the crossing that a whole valley needs, not paid for by the crown, not paid for by the box, paid for by them, and nobody had asked them. So I did not write a defense. I did not go to the chancery, and I did not go to the court, and that is on the record, because it is the only reason anybody in Taro Ford ever listened to me afterward. I took the ledger with 1 line in it, and I took the farmer's own paper, and I got on the cart that the rider was going back on. You cannot cross a ford in a wet autumn just because a bridge used to be there. I found that out with my legs, in front of a boy who has probably told the story at every harvest since. The river was up to the belly of the horse and running fast and brown, with hay and fence rail going past in it, and the bank on the far side was cut away where the abutment had been. I went in with my boots on because I had decided the water was the fastest way to look competent. The bed dropped out from under my left foot at the 3rd step. There was a hole where a piling had been for 200 years, and the current put me in it, and I went under holding a ledger over my head like an idiot with priorities. A boy on the far bank was shouting at me before I even went under, and I had heard him and decided he was being unhelpful. He said not there, that is where the piling was. I came up 2 lengths downstream, got a knee on gravel, and crawled out into the reeds with one boot gone, and the ledger dry, and my hips singing, where the dais steps had already hit it. The boy watched me stand up and he did not laugh, which I appreciated more than I can say. He said, everybody knows about that hole. Then he said, you are not from here. That is how the 6 villages of Taro Ford first saw the keeper of the complaint box, soaked to the chest, 1 boot, ink on my knuckles, holding a book above my head. The village square had about 40 people standing in it, and it was the wrong week of the year for 40 people to be standing anywhere, which told me the size of the problem before anybody spoke. It was harvest week. The wheat was in and stacked and dry, which is the good news. And it is the good news that kills you if you cannot do the next thing with it. A farmer named Wen Ardle showed me the sheaves under canvas and said the grain is fine. Then he pointed across the brown water and said the mill is on the other bank. That is the shape of it, and I want it exact, because there is no mystery here and no curse. Nobody in Taro Ford was starving because of injustice. They were starving because they could not grind. Wheat is not food. Wheat is food after a millstone touches it. The nearest other mill is at Bellhurst, over the ridge, 2 days there and 2 days back with a loaded cart. 6 villages, about 1,100 people. 1 harvest, already cut, sitting under canvas in a wet autumn, and every day it gets closer to spoiling. Then Darrow came out of the crowd. Miller of Taro Ford, chest like a barrel, flour in the seams of his hands, and the only man in that square whose whole living had just gone still. He did not ask who I was. He had already been told. He walked up close and said the word that gets people burned in a bad year. He said sorcery. He said the crown has sent us a boy who says a word and a bridge that has stood 200 years is in the river. 40 faces turned to me at once, and my throat closed exactly as it always does, and the sound stopped at the back of my mouth. Nothing came out. Not one word. So I fell back on the one thing that has ever worked for me in a crowd. I stopped trying to make my throat work, and I reached into my coat, and I used paper instead of a voice. I took the 6 lines out of my coat, wet at the corner, and I held them up so the front row could see the hand. Then I put them in Darrow's palm. He looked down at them, and his face did something complicated, because it was not his writing, but he knew whose it was. I got my voice down to the level it works at, which is about the level of a man asking for a docket number, and I said, you wrote it. Read your own sentence out loud. He said, it is not mine. I said, no. It is Wen Ardle's, and he is standing behind your left shoulder, and he signed it, and I have his name in the register from a tenancy roll in my own hand. Then, Wen Ardle went the color of wet plaster, and 40 people looked at him instead of me, and he took his own paper back off the miller. He read it out to his own neighbors in a flat voice. He got as far as the word robbery and stopped there, because he could hear it happening in his mouth while he was saying it. Nobody in that square needed it explained after that. The words went in one end and a bridge came out of the other, and the man who wrote the words was one of them. Darrow stood there with his flower hands open at his sides and the anger going out of his shoulders, which is worse to watch than anger. Then he said, quieter, so is that what happened? I said yes. And the reason it happened is that I read it at 4 in the morning without checking it against anything, and that part is mine, not his. I have watched men lose a crowd by defending themselves. You do not lose a crowd by taking your own half of it out loud, first, with a number attached. Somebody near the back asked the question that turned that day around, and I have never learned who it was. She asked what the water in the city cost. So I opened the book. Not a speech. A book, in the middle of the square, on the tail of a cart, with the rain starting again. 1 clean well, 6 sluices closed above it, 40 families, 7 paving stones out of the yard of Halbert Pruitt, taken in payment, page 1 of 1, dated in my hand. Then I turned it round so they could read it, and I said the second line out loud, the one I had written on the way over on the cart. 1 bridge, Taro Ford, 900 tons, taken in payment for a stone lane on Tannery Row. Read by me, written by Wen Ardle. Nothing here is free and nothing here is hidden. That is what a payment book is for. It is not an apology. It is a receipt. And a receipt from the man who did it beats a rumor from a man who did not. 3 men in that square went to their coats and took out folded papers and tore them up in front of me without asking anybody's permission. One of them told me what his had said. He wanted his neighbor's dog dealt with. He said he had written the word dealt with, and now he had looked at the word again. Darrow did not tear anything up. Darrow asked the first useful question anybody in that valley asked me. He said, "What do we do about the mill?" So we did that instead of shouting. I asked who is bound by law to keep the crossing, and everybody in the square gave me a different answer, which is what always happens. I had the ward volume in the cart because I do not travel without it. It took me until the light went to find the entry, on the tail of that cart under a piece of canvas, with Darrow holding a lamp. Upkeep of the crossing at Taro Ford, together with the taking of the toll, charged upon the Royal Farm of Tolls, renewed 9 years ago, held in the name of the Lord Chancellor. I read that line 3 times. Then, I put my finger on it and let Darrow read it, because I wanted a witness who did not work for me. The toll they had been paying for 9 years at 10 coins a crossing, when the lawful figure written above it in the same entry was 2, went to the man who had signed my posting the day before he pretended to sign it. That was the moment the story stopped being about a boy with a crate. Dask kicked me down some stairs and burned my hand, and Dask is nothing. The man who buys the roads takes 10 coins from a farmer at a bridge and calls it upkeep, and never comes near the bridge, and cannot be shouted at, because he is polite, and he is legal, and he owns the paper. I understood that on a cart in the rain, in a village square, and it cost me nothing to understand, and it cost me the next 4 years to do anything about. But the harvest was still under canvas, and the water was still up over the old bed, and no entry in a ward volume has ever ground 1 sack of wheat for anybody in the history of this kingdom. So we did the small thing. There was a flat ferry hull rotting in the reeds a quarter mile down, left from before the bridge went up, and Darrow knew whose it was. 2 of us bailed it, and 4 of us patched the bottom with tar and canvas out of the mill store, and a smith called Perrin Lowe put new eyes in the bow and stern for the rope. We ran a rope across on the pack horse at the shallow bend, doubled it, and had a 2-horse ferry working by the middle of the second day. It takes 4 sacks and 2 horses a crossing. 6 hours to the mill and back, instead of 48 to Belhurst. 6 hours. Not clever, and not magic. A rope, a hull, and 1 man who knew where the hull was. And this is the thing I made sure of, because I had learned it on my knees in a stone lane. Before anybody read anything, we chose what would pay. There is a tithe barn on the ridge above Taro Ford. 9 years empty, roof half open, owned by the Church of the Warden, and used by nobody but owls. I told them that if they ever wanted the bridge back, the words would have to say where the stone comes from, and the words would have to name that barn, and they would have to write it themselves. When Ardle asked whether that was allowed, I said the box does not care what is allowed. It cares what is true and what is written. Naming the barn does not make it kind. It makes it chosen. He asked who owns the barn. I told him the church does. He stood there and thought about it, and that hesitation is the most honest thing anybody did that week. Oda Brill came out on the second cart with 2 lamps and a bundle of dry socks, which is the closest thing to affection I had received in some years. She stood on the bank and looked at the 2 piers in the water for a long time. Then she said it out loud to all of the village instead of to me, and that was deliberate. She said 7 days. If a paper sits unread in that box for 7 days, it happens anyway, on the 7th, in the crudest way the words allow, and nobody chooses where the payment comes from. A woman with a baby on her hip asked what crudest means. Oda said it means your wall, on a day you did not pick because a stranger's paper sat in a box too long. 40 people went quiet in a way I could feel on the back of my neck. Then Darrow said it. To nobody in particular, looking at the water, so we should be careful how we write things down. I asked Oda, on the bank, out of earshot, how she knows the rule about the 7th day. She said she knows. I asked how. She said she knows, and she went to help with the rope. I let it go. I had a burned hand, a lost boot, a harvest half moving, and a lane made out of a bridge, and I did not have room in my head for one more locked door. That door stayed shut for a long time, and when it finally opened, it took the floor out from under me. But not that week, and not on that bank. By the evening of the second day, the ferry had run 19 crossings, and Darrow's stones were turning, and the square smelled of flour instead of wet canvas. I wrote it in the book. Ferry at Taro Ford. 1 hull, 1 rope, 2 horses. 6 hours in place of 48. Cost, 1 afternoon of 6 men and 4 pounds of tar out of the mill store, paid by the mill. They put me on a cart at dawn with both boots dry and a sack of new bread, and when Ardle shook my hand and Darrow did not. Darrow walked beside the cart to the top of the rise, and then said the thing that told me what was coming. He said all the valley knows now, not just us. I said knows what? He said that a man in the city reads a paper and the world changes, and that nobody in this valley has ever been able to make anything change before. I thought about that sentence for the whole 11 miles back to the city, with the sack of bread on my knees. I thought it was a compliment. It was a weather report. The stranger had been in the square on the second afternoon, and I had noticed him, and done nothing, because he was polite and he was writing. Small book, good boots, clean cuffs, and he was not writing about the ferry. He was writing down names and how many crossings and how many sacks and who spoke. I asked him whose man he was. He smiled like a shopkeeper and said the chancellor likes to know where his roads went. Then he said good day and rode out before dark. That is the thing to sit with. While I was patching a hull, he was making a file, and his ledger was better bound than mine. I got back to the registry at dusk on the third day with my sack of bread and my dry boots and my page 2 of the payment book. There were people on the registry stairs, not 2 or 3. The line went up the steps, along the wall of the lane, and round the corner by the gate, and it did not move when I came. Tam Wick was standing in my doorway. Baker's son, 17, flour on his sleeves, holding a basket he had clearly used as an excuse to be there. He said there are more outside, sir. And he said it as a boy says, a thing he has been rehearsing on the step for an hour. Then he stood aside, and I saw the crate. The box was full, not 3 papers. Papers to the slot, and papers on the desk beside it where people had pushed them through and they had fallen out, and papers on the floor. I counted them that night with the candle down to nothing. 41. Every one of them dated in the corner. The oldest of them was already 4 days gone. 3 papers in my first week, and a whole valley had told a whole city, and now there were 41 fuses burning in one crate in an unheated room below the street. I sat down on the stool that Oda Brill had put beside that desk before I ever arrived in the room, and I did the arithmetic that has run every day of my life since then. 41 papers, 7 days each from the date in the corner, 1 pair of eyes, and nothing happens until I read them. And everything happens if I do not. I sorted them by the date in the corner, oldest at the top, because this is the only sort that means anything when a fuse is the thing you are managing. I heard myself call it triage, in a voice I did not recognize, at midnight, in a cellar, with a bread sack still tied on my belt. And somewhere under the arithmetic, a thought arrived that I did not want, and it was not about miracles at all. It was that I could not read fast enough, and that this was now the only problem I had. 41 papers with a fuse on each of them, and 1 pair of eyes. And I did the thing that everybody at the Chancery later called arrogance, and that I still say was the only sane move available. I stopped reading. For 2 whole days, I read nothing at all, and I went back out to Taro Ford with a bundle of ruled paper under my arm and a borrowed cart, and I taught. Here is the reasoning, and it is not noble. A paper I read badly costs a bridge. A paper left in the crate too long costs somebody a wall on the 7th day. Neither of those is a choice I want to keep making at 4 in the morning. But a paper that is written properly before it ever reaches the box costs what its author decided it should cost. That is all of the trade. That is all I have ever actually done for anybody. So I set up a trestle table in the square at Taro Ford, in the wind, with a stone on the paper stack to hold it down, and I told them the 3 things. Before I read anything, I said, you tell me 3 things. What broke, how you measure it, and what may be taken to pay for putting it right. When Ardle asked why the 3rd one, I said because the box will take something whether you name it or not, and the only question on the table is whether a stranger chooses or you do. A woman at the back said that sounded like being asked to pick which of your neighbors gets robbed. I said yes. That is exactly what it is, and pretending otherwise is how a bridge ends up in a lane in the city. Nobody liked it. I would like that recorded, because the version people tell now has them cheering. They did not cheer. They stood in the wind and looked at each other and did the sum in their heads. Then they sat down on the benches out of the alehouse and started writing, and I handed out ruled paper as if it were weapons, because to me it is. They had been at it for about an hour, and I was beginning to think it was going to be a quiet afternoon. And that is when the village scribe stood up off his bench. Osk had held the pen in Taro Ford for 30 years. Wills, tenancies, marriage lines, and the letters that daughters sent home from service. He wore his inkpot on a cord like a badge of office, which it was. He said, words are my trade. Then he looked round at his own neighbors sitting on the benches with my ruled paper on their knees, and he said, you are a boy with a crate. 40 people went quiet, and every one of them wanted to see it. There is nothing in a village more enjoyable than a fight between 2 men who both work sitting down. My throat closed. Of course it did. 2 days earlier I had failed to say 1 word in that same square, and now the man with the inkpot on a cord was standing 3 feet away, waiting for me to be eloquent. So I did not answer him with my mouth. I turned the page round on the table, took his own pen out of his hand with a nod, and wrote 1 true thing 3 different ways. The toll is robbery. That was the first line, and I did not have to invent it, because it was 6 lines of when Ardle still folded in my coat. The toll is 10 coins, where 2 were lawful. That was the second line. And I wrote it slower than the first, so that the front row could watch the difference arrive. The collector keeps 8 coins from every crossing and has done so for 9 years. That was the third, and it took me twice as long to write as the other 2 together. Then, I gave the pen back to Osk, and I asked him to read all 3 out loud to the village, because his voice works and mine does not, and because I wanted them to hear it from a man they already trusted. He read them out. Then I said, at the volume of a clerk reading out a shelf number, one of those 3 is true and takes your bridge. 1 is true and takes your money back. 1 is true and takes a man to court. Nobody said anything for a moment, and the wind took the top sheet off the stack, and nobody chased it. Then a farrier at the front said, slowly, they are all true though. And that is the lesson. That is what I could never have got across with a speech. All 3 were true, and all 3 were the same grievance, and they build 3 different worlds. Osk sat down on the end of the bench with his own pen still in his hand, and he looked at those 3 lines for a long time, and the inkpot on the cord swung and knocked against his knee. He did not concede, and I did not want him to. What he said was that the second one is badly punctuated, and he was right, and I fixed the comma in front of everybody and thanked him for it. I have never once been sorry about that comma. A man who has been the only literate hand in a valley for 30 years does not need beating. He needs a job in the new arrangement. He took over the table by the middle of the afternoon. I sat on the cart tail and let him, and he was better at it than me, because they were his neighbors and he knew which of them could not read at all. Then the roof happened. I bring it up in every reading room I have ever set up since, and it is the reason I will not let anybody call the wording a formality in front of me. A woman named Iselle Brandt came up with a paper already written, in her own hand, 4 lines, hard and clear. Her landlord had let her roof go for 2 winters, and her ceiling had come down on her daughter's bed. That is true. I checked it in the ward book that evening, and it was true twice over, because he had drawn a repair allowance from the parish for that same roof the year before. She wanted it read there and then. She said she had waited 2 winters, which was fair, and she pushed it at me across the table. And I did the thing I now make every reader in this kingdom do before their hand touches a page. I read it out to her, aloud, slowly, and I put my finger on each noun as I said it. Then I asked her where the nearest suitable slate to her house is, and she said she did not know, and I said I do, because I had the ward volume open on the cart. The nearest slate roof of that pitch and that size, within the reach of that sentence, as she had written it, is the almshouse 2 lanes over, where 60 people sleep. She went white. Osk stood up off the bench. Iselle Brandt looked at her own 4 lines and said out loud, in front of everybody, I would have taken the roof off the almshouse. She would have. Not out of malice, out of a grievance that was completely true. Written by a woman with a hole over her daughter's bed, at the end of 2 winters of asking. And that was the danger nobody understands about that box. And it is not the villains. The villains I can handle. It is the good people who are entirely in the right. She took the paper back off the table and tore it herself. And then she sat down and wrote it again with Osk over her shoulder. And the second version named her landlord's own barn as the source of the slate. He has a barn. He roofed it the year he let hers go. The barn is empty 6 months a year, and it is his, and the words said so. I did not read that one for another week, because it was not the oldest paper in the pile, and I had learned about cues by then. When I did, her ceiling closed, and his barn lost its west slope, and nobody else in that lane paid a penny. But the bridge came before the roof in the order of the days, and the bridge was the debt I had actually come out there to pay. So let me finish that first. When Ardle wrote the 4th version himself, on the 3rd day, with all of Square watching, and he wrote it slowly because his hand presses too hard. He wrote that the crossing at Taro Ford is charged upon the farm of tolls and has not been kept. He wrote that the lawful toll is 2 coins and that 10 have been taken for 9 years. And then, because we had spent 2 days on exactly this, he wrote the line that made it his choice instead of mine. Take the stone for it from the tithe barn on the ridge, which has stood empty 9 years. He stopped before he signed it. He asked me who owns that barn. I told him the Church of the Warden owns it, and I did not soften that, and I let the pause sit. 1,100 people needed a crossing. The warden's barn had owls in it. He looked at the ridge for a while, and then he signed his name. And that hesitation is the part of it I want remembered, because it was the honest part. I read it out at noon, in the square, with the whole village standing well back from the water, the way you stand back from a horse you do not know. It came up out of the riverbed, not fast and not like thunder. It came up the way a wall goes up when good masons are working and somebody has taken the day away. The 2 piers grew their arches back. The parapet closed along the top, and it closed with a groove worn into it where a rope has rubbed for 2 generations of carts, because it was the same stone that had gone into my lane. Half of it came out of my lane. The clean channel above Nessa's well stayed, because her sentence was still true and still standing, and the box took the difference off the ridge. I turned round in time to see the roof of the tithe barn drop out of sight behind the trees on the ridgeline, and the sound of it arrived about 2 breaths later. Then, the toll post at the near end of the bridge fell over on its side, and the tin plate nailed to it with the figure 10 on it split down the middle. Darrow walked out onto his own bridge before anybody else dared, right to the middle, and put both flower hands flat on the parapet. Then he came back and looked at the new post and the new plate, and the plate said 2 coins, and it said it in the same lettering as every other lawful toll plate in the kingdom. He put his thumb on the figure and read it out to the square twice over, and his voice cracked on the second one. He said 2 coins, lawful, same as my father paid. The square did not cheer that either, and I've thought about why. I think it was because everybody there had spent 3 days learning what it cost, and you cannot cheer a receipt. What they did instead was better than cheering, and it took me a while to notice it happening. They queued, not at my cart, at Osk's table with the ruled paper on it. 19 papers were written in Tarot Ford in the 4 days after the bridge came back, and every one of them named its own place of payment, and I read every one of them at the pace of the fuse. Then the neighboring villages came, because word goes along a river faster than it goes along a road. Ashmill, Prynne, Holloway, Dunt, and Corey Green and Tarot Ford makes 6. Osk and I put the 3 questions on a single sheet and wrote it out 50 times between us in his hand because his letters are better than mine. What broke? How you measure it? What may be taken to pay? Then a line for the writer's own name and the date, because a paper without a date is a fuse you cannot see. 6 villages and 1 form between them. And the thing that mattered most to me was not the number. It was that they did not need me in the room, or even in the valley, to use it properly. A woman from Holloway explained it to me later on the road, and I have never improved on her wording. She said we read it aloud at the mill first. If it sounds wrong, we fix it before you come. That is the entire craft. A grievance read aloud in front of the people it will land on gets fixed by them before it ever reaches a fuse. The count that week was 14 papers read, none burned, and nothing taken that had not been named in the text by the person who wrote it. I wrote all of it in the book. 14 readings, 19 written. 1 barn roof, Church of the Warden, entered against the crossing at Tarot Ford. Nothing owed to any household that had not chosen it. And then Darrow paid me, not in coin, and not on purpose, and I would put money on the fact that he does not remember doing it at all, and that is what made it worth having. There was an argument at the ferry landing about who had the right to the old hull now that the bridge was back, and it got loud, and 2 men wanted a ruling. Darrow turned round in the middle of it, with his flower hands up in the air, as a man does when he wants the noise to stop, and he said, Ask Vane about it. He heard himself do it. He stopped, and he looked at the ground for about 2 seconds, and then he went back to arguing about the hull with his neighbor. 2 days earlier, that man had stood in front of 40 people and called me sorcery. Then he used my name as the answer to a question, in public, without deciding to. I did not say anything about it. I went and sat on the cart and wrote it in the book under the payment lines, dated in the same steady hand, because it was a receipt too. Then a boy with flour on his sleeves came out from behind the bread cart, where he had clearly been standing for a while working up to it. Tam Wick, 17, baker's son from the row behind the registry in the city, which is 9 miles from Tarot Ford, and he had walked it. He asked whether it was true that anybody could learn to do the reading, or whether it had to be a man from the chancery with a license. I said anybody who can read and who is willing to be slow about it. Then he told me the thing that decided it, and he told it to me like a confession. He said I read slow. I have always read slow. My father says it is because I move my mouth when I do it, and my brothers say worse than that. Is slow bad for this? I said slow is all of the job. Then I had to say it a second time, because his face had not believed it the first time, and I have since had to say it to 211 other people. He sat down on the cart tail with me and read out one of the 19 papers, syllable by syllable, moving his mouth, taking about 9 seconds over the word grievance, and he got it exactly right. 2 people is not a service. 2 people is 1 person and a spare. It was still the first time since the Great Hall that the arithmetic in my head had moved in the right direction. I did not know yet that I would need 9 of him inside 2 months, or that the last one I trained would be the one who nearly ended it. We were loading the cart to go back to the city on the 4th evening when the girl arrived, and she had walked 11 miles on the ridge road in the wet. She was about 15, stable clothes, canvas apron, hair tied with a strip of harness leather, and she stood at the tail of the cart and waited to be told to leave. Her hands were wrong. That was the first thing I noticed. And I noticed it before her face, because her knuckles were split across the backs of both hands, and there were lime burns up her wrists. I asked what happened to her hands. She said she cleans his scales. Then she said my hands look like this because of his scales. I asked whose scales? She said Lord Bram Osley, of Osley, 3 villages over the ridge, and she said it the way you say the name of weather. She had a paper folded twice in her apron. She had not written it at Osk's table, and she had never seen the sheet with the 3 questions on it. I asked her to sit down and let me read it out to her the way I do. She said no. She said she had walked since dawn, and she had to be back before the stable was locked, or it would be worse. I asked her name for the register because a paper with no name is nothing, and she gave it to me. Rilla Odd, stable girl at Osley. Then she pushed the paper through the slot in the top of the box herself, which she had every right to do, and stepped back and put her hands behind her. I offered her tea. She refused it in the tone of a girl who expects to be thrown out of somewhere within the next minute. And then she left up the ridge road at a walk that was faster than mine. I could have gone after her. I have gone over that. But her paper was in the box, and the fuse was running from the moment it went through the slot, and the fuse does not care that she was in a hurry. So I did what I had spent 3 days teaching 6 villages never to do. I unfolded a paper I had not checked from a girl I had met for 4 minutes, about a man I knew nothing about. It was 1 line on a scrap the size of my hand. 9 words. The letters were pressed hard enough to score the paper, and the last word ran downhill off the edge of it. Our Lord is a greedy pig. 9 words, no measurement, no place of payment, and nothing else on the page except a girl's name that I had written on it myself for the register. I read it twice to myself in the cart. My first thought was that the poor girl had walked 11 miles to call a lord a name, and my second thought was about her wrists. There was nothing in it to check. That is what I told myself sitting there with the ward volume 6 inches from my knee. It is not a claim about a roof or a toll or a well. It is an insult. The box needs the writer to be the wronged party. And she was, and the box needs the thing to be true. And an insult cannot be true, so nothing would happen, and the fuse would run out, and nothing would happen then either. I almost changed the word greedy to avaricious out of pure habit, and I stopped myself, because my hand on her page makes it nothing. So I read her 9 words out loud on the cart tail in Terrowford in the rain, with Tam Wick sitting beside me eating bread. Nothing happened in the square. Nothing happened on the ridge. Tam asked whether it had worked, and I said no. And I felt the kind of relief you feel when a suspicion turns out to be foolish. 3 villages away over the ridge, in a stone hall with about 60 tenants standing in it, something started screaming, and it went on screaming, and it was not a man. They came for me at the registry at first light with a warrant that was not a warrant, and I went with them, because arguing about the form of a document while 2 men hold your arms is a way to get hurt for nothing. 2 of Osley's men, leather coats, the estate badge on the shoulder, and a horse each and 1 spare for me, which told me they had been told to bring me alive and quickly. The tall one twisted my wrist up behind my shoulder to get me onto the horse, and he held it there for the first mile of the ridge road, and my hand had only just stopped weeping under the bandage. By the top of the ridge, 2 of my fingers had gone numb, and stayed numb for 3 days. I mention it because everybody remembers the pig, and nobody remembers how I arrived. I asked what the charge was. The tall one said sorcery, against the person of a lord. Then he said his lordship is already speaking about it in the hall, so you will want to be quick. That was the useful part of the sentence. His lordship was already speaking. A man who is speaking in his own hall in front of his own tenants is a man who has decided how the morning ends. Osley Hall is 1 long stone room with a fire at the far end that does not heat it, and about 60 tenants were standing in it on the flags, in their working clothes, in the middle of a working day. This is the detail that told me what kind of man he was before he opened his mouth. 60 people off the land at harvest, standing in a cold room so that he could be seen being angry at somebody. Lord Bram Osley was 44, heavy through the shoulders, with a chain of office on his chest that he had polished himself or had polished for him that morning. His steward stood at his elbow with a wax tablet. That was Ivo Tarn, thin, 38, and the only man in that hall who was looking at me instead of at his lord. Let me be careful here, because what happened next has been told badly by everybody who was not in the room, including 2 ballads that I am told are still sung. Osley was in the middle of a sentence about thieving commoners and the new fashion of writing papers about their betters, and he was building toward me, and he was enjoying it. Then he said the line that finished him, and he said it with his hand flat on his own chain of office. He said, "Every tenant here knows I have never taken 1 coin more than my due." There was no light, no thunder, and no smell of sulfur. What there was a sound like a man losing his footing on a step, and then he was not there anymore. There was a pig on the flags in front of the high seat, wearing a chain of office, standing in a lord's boots, which it was rapidly getting out of. A good pig, honestly. 200 pounds of it, pink through the shoulders, with the small clever eyes that pigs have and that everybody pretends not to notice. For about 3 heartbeats, nobody in that hall moved. 60 tenants, 2 guards, a steward with a wax tablet, and me with a numb hand, and the fire not heating anything. Then the chain slid off over its head and hit the stone, and the pig walked forward and put its snout in the spilled wine at the foot of the step, and that broke the room. I have been asked many times what I felt. I will tell the truth. My first clear thought was that I had no idea which register this went in. Not fear, not triumph. A filing question. That is what my head does under pressure, and it is the only reason I was useful in that room in the next 10 minutes. Because the second thought arrived fast behind it, and it was much worse. I had read a paper without checking it, again, 6 days after the last time, and something had happened that I had told a whole valley could not happen. 9 words from a stable girl. Our Lord is a greedy pig. I had told myself an insult cannot be true, and I had been so pleased with the reasoning that I had not tested it once. The box does not judge the shape of a sentence. It judges the substance. That is the rule I learned standing in Osley Hall, and it is the rule that has frightened me ever since. Then a girl's voice came across the noise from the side of the hall, and it was not frightened, and it was not sorry, and it did not wait for anybody to give her leave to speak. Rilla Odd had walked back over the ridge overnight, and she was standing by the passage to the stables in her canvas apron with her split hands held in front of her. She said he weighs the tenant's grain on his own scales. Then she said louder, "Because 60 people were turning round, I clean the scales. I clean them twice a week. I know what is under the pans." A tenant near the front said out loud that the flour weights had been wrong for years. Another one said his sacks had come back light every autumn since his father died. Tarn told them all to be silent, and nobody was silent. And that is the moment the hall changed owners. Not when the pig appeared. When the girl said what she cleaned. I asked her to show me the scales, and I asked it in the middle of the noise. And about 4 people looked at me as if I were mad. She took me through the passage with 2 tenants following, and the scales were on the trestle in the grain store, and the pans came off the beam in my hands without a tool. There was lead run into the underside of the receiving pan in a cup that had been cut for it, and it was old lead, dull and dirty, and the cut was clean work by somebody who was paid well. I put the pans back and weighed a sack against the estate's own iron standard from the shelf, twice, with 2 tenants watching, and it read a 5th light both times. A 5th. On every sack, at every harvest, from every household on that estate, for as long as that lead had been sitting in that cup. I cut the lead out of the cup with a stable knife in front of 2 tenants, wrapped it in a page of my own notes, and put it in my coat, and I wrote on the wrapper who had watched me do it. That lump of lead weighed about 4 ounces, and it was worth more than every clever thing I said that day, because a pig cannot deny it, and a chancery man cannot argue with a weight. So, the 9 words were true. Not a figure of speech, not a girl's temper. A man who takes a 5th more than his due, written down by the person whose hands were split from cleaning the evidence. I went back into the hall with the pan under my arm. The pig was in the rushes by then, and somebody had opened the yard door, and Gethin Dask had arrived through it with 2 of his own men. Of course he had. He had spent the season at Osley's table eating Osley's meat and calling it patronage. And now his patron was on the floor. He came at me through the crowd, with the blade of embers already out, and the orange came up along the edge of it while he walked, and people got out of his way properly. He said, "Undo it, scribe." He put the flat of that blade under my chin and lifted it, and the heat came off it in a way that made my eyes water and blistered a line under my jaw. I have never claimed to be brave. My legs were shaking, but my throat, for once in my life, did the one thing it can do, which is a flat clerk's voice at a small volume. I said I cannot. Then I said the rest of it, slowly, because my jaw was shaking, and I did not trust it to go fast. "Neither can you, and you are the one holding a sword." He said, "Undo it, or I will open you here." And I said the only useful thing available, which was not a defiance. I said the paper is hers. It is true, even if you kill me the pan is still light. Somebody in the crowd laughed. Not at me. That was the sound I had been waiting a week to hear, and it happened while a burning sword was under my jaw, and it turned my knees to nothing. Dask heard it too. He looked round the hall and found 60 faces looking back at him with no fear in them at all. because a room that has just watched a lord become a pig has run out of things to be frightened of. He took the blade off my throat and shouted at the tenants that they were witnesses to sorcery, and a woman at the back said, "We are witnesses to short waits, sir," and the hall laughed again, harder. It is the whole of Dask's part in that day. He came in with a burning sword, and he left with nothing, and the man he had come to impress was eating rushes. Then the pig panicked, because the shouting had got loud and something had banged the door, and 200 pounds of frightened animal went through the trestle tables along the wall. The near trestle came off its legs, and the bench went over on top of a servant, an old man carrying a jug, and it caught his ankle and pinned it against the step, and he screamed properly. Nobody moved for a second because everybody was watching the pig. So I put the scale pan down and got to him, and I said the only thing worth saying, which was lift on 3, not the bench, the end of it. 2 tenants took the end with me. We got it up about a hand's width, and a third man dragged him clear by the shoulders, and his ankle was purple and swelling and not broken. His name was Cobbett, and he had been pouring wine in that hall for 31 years, and he told me afterward that no one had ever asked his name in it before. That goes in the account, because the ballads have me standing over a pig being clever. What actually happened is that I was on my knees on cold flags with an old man's boot in my hands and my hand bleeding again inside its bandage. Then I did the thing that everybody in that room found strange, and that saved every single one of them. I asked for 2 witnesses, a table and light, because this is what I knew. Standing in a hall where a lord had become a pig in front of 60 people. By nightfall, this would be a rumor, and a rumor cannot be enforced. Tomorrow the chancery would send a man, and the man would ask whether it had really happened, and 60 tenants would say yes, and he would write down that 60 peasants said yes, and nothing would follow, unless it existed on paper, properly, in a form the chancery uses itself, with names against every mark, so that denying it means calling 60 named people liars in writing. So I sat down at the end of the high table with Tarn's own wax tablet and a sheet of estate paper, and I took an inventory of witnesses, and it took me 2 hours. 60 names. Trade against each name, where each of them was standing, what each of them heard him say in the sentence before it happened, in their own words, 1 line each. Then the physical schedule, 1 scale pan, receiving side, lead run into a cut cup on the underside, weight of the lead, error of 1/5, verified twice against the estate iron standard in the presence of Wen Harrow and Cobbett. Then the paper itself. 9 words. Author, Rilla Odd, stable girl, aged about 15, employed at the hall 3 years. Date of writing. Date and hour of reading. By me, Intero Ford. Then, the last line, which I have used at the bottom of every incident record I have ever made since. Read aloud to all named witnesses before signing, in this hall, this evening. 60 people put a mark or a name on that sheet. Osk would have wept at the handwriting. The chancery could not touch a word of it. And in the middle of it, I asked Tarn, who was standing over me the entire time, how his lordship spelled Osley, because there are 2 ways, and I wanted the record exact. He gave me a look I still enjoy. Then he spelled it. A steward cannot refuse to spell his master's name in front of 60 tenants, and I knew that when I asked. The tithe came out of the crowd while I was still writing, and it came from the tenants, not from me, and that is why it stuck. A man named Wen Harrow said the charter of the estate is nailed in the church porch, and it says a 10th. He said we have been paying a 5th since the year the old lord died. I sent 2 men for the charter board, and they brought it back with the nails still in it. And Osk's opposite number, the church clerk of Osley, read it out to the hall, because my voice was gone by then. A 10th in kind, or its value in coin. 11 years of a 5th. 3 villages on that estate, about 90 households, entered into the record with the difference calculated per household by the church clerk and me, side by side, until 2 in the morning. Nobody was granted anything by that box in Osley Hall that night. Nothing was rebuilt, and nothing was taken, and no material moved. What happened was an inventory, and by the following market day, 3 villages had stopped paying the 5th, and no lord's man came to argue, because there was no lawful signatory left to send one. The church clerk and I put the difference at about 11 sacks a household a year, across roughly 90 households, across 11 years, and then we both stopped and looked at the total, and neither of us said anything about it. I did not understand that sentence until Tarn made me understand it, and he did it that same night, standing over my shoulder while I blotted the last page. He waited until the church clerk had gone out for more candles, and then he said it quietly, as a man tells you the price of something. He said, "You know a pig cannot sign." I said, "I know." And he said, "Then you know that nothing done in this hall for 11 years can be confirmed, and nothing done by you tonight can be confirmed either, and he was smiling for the first time all day. I did not have an answer. I had a sheet with 60 marks on it, and a lead cup in my pocket, and a numb hand, and the steward of that estate had just found the crack in all of it before I had. Then he had a horse saddled, at 2 in the morning, and he rode for the city while I was still counting sacks with a church clerk. Nessa Quill came out to Osley 2 days later on a carrier's cart, with Tobin, because word had gone round the city that a lord had been turned into a pig, and half the tannery row wanted to see it. They kept the pig in the walled orchard by then, and the steward's men fed it, and there was a queue at the gate of people who had walked out from 3 villages to look through the bars. Tobin was delighted with it the way a 9-year-old is delighted with anything enormous, and he asked me twice whether it could be eaten, and I pretended not to hear him twice. The steward's men were charging a copper a head at the orchard gate by the second day, and it is the most honest thing anybody on that estate had done in 11 years, and I made a note of it in the book out of pure spite. He had a cough that day. I heard it, and I remember thinking that every child on that row has a cough in the autumn, and I said nothing about it to his sister, and I will carry that. Nessa did not look at the pig for long. She stood at the orchard gate with her hands on the bars and asked me the question she had walked out there to ask. She said it looking through the bars and not at me, in the flat voice children use when they have been carrying a question a long way. If somebody dies and it was not fair, can you write about that? I told her the truth, because she would have known if I softened it. I said no. The box only acts on a wrong already done, and only for the person it was done to, and the dead cannot write. She asked whether the person left behind counts as somebody it was done to. I said I did not know. Then I said, because she was 12 and I was 19 and I thought I was being kind, that I hoped never to find out. She looked through the bars at a lord eating windfall apples, and did not say anything else about it. I did not write that conversation in the book. I should have. 8 months later, she wrote the paper that put a fuse under the office of a god, and every word of it came out of that afternoon at the orchard gate, and I had already been told what she was thinking. On the ride back, I wrote the second rule of the reading, and I wrote it in the payment book because it was the only book I carried. Rule 1 is read the sentence out loud before the box hears it. Rule 2, from Osley Hall, is test the substance and not the shape. Every noun, even the insults, especially the insults. I tested it that evening on a paper from Cobb Lane about a barking dog, and I read it aloud 4 times, going over each word like a man checking a rope, and I still made myself sweat over it. The dog complaint was true, and it was harmless, and the box moved 1 fence post 9 inches. And that was the whole of what happened. And I sat down afterward as if I had defused something, because I had. Tam Wick read his first paper that same evening, standing up, moving his mouth, with me holding the ward volume open at the relevant drain and my finger on the entry. It took him 4 minutes and he got every noun of it right. 9 papers read that week. 2 withdrawn by their authors after we read them out loud together. None burned. Payment book entries, all named in the text. Tarn reached the city 2 days ahead of me, and the summons was already nailed to the registry door when I got back, in Chancery script, in a hand I recognized from my own training room. In the matter of 41 unsealed papers and of the keeper of the complaint box, before the King's Bench, on the 8th day of the month, at the hour of 9 in the small hours. I stood on my own step and read it 3 times, and I noticed that the penmanship was beautiful. And then I sat down on the step because my legs had had enough of that week. There were 19 people in the lane behind me holding papers, and one of them asked whether the reading would still happen tomorrow. And I said yes, and I meant it, and I had no idea how. The wax at the bottom of it was not Osley's, and it was not the court's. It was the seal of the Lord Chancellor of Verlund, pressed deep into red wax on a summons about a stable girl's paper. And the wax had gone glassy at the edge, the way it does when it is pressed while it is still too hot. That is what happens when a thing is sealed at night, in a hurry, by a man who has just been handed exactly what he wanted. The King's Bench sits in a hall with a floor of black and white stone, and they had put the box on a table in the middle of it on a cushion, as if it were evidence in a murder. 41 papers were laid out beside it in rows. Somebody in the Chancery had spent real time on that arrangement, and the effect was exactly what it was meant to be, which was a heap of scrap paper looking ridiculous under a gold ceiling. I stood where the usher put me, with my hand freshly wrapped, and I counted the papers twice while the court was still being announced, because the count was the only thing in that room I controlled. 41. All present. I had read 14 of them, and every one of the 14 had a line in the payment book, and the book was under my arm. I had also brought the 4 ounces of lead out of the Osley scale pan, wrapped in its own note of witnesses, and I put it on the table beside the papers, without being asked to. Nobody mentioned it for the whole first hour. It sat there in front of the bench, dirty and dull, and every man on that bench looked at it at least twice. Ivo Tarn opened. Thin voice, good pace, no shouting, and he did not once say the word sorcery, which told me he had spent his 2 extra days in the city being taught. He said, "Not one of these bears a seal." Then he said, slowly, "Not one of them is a petition in law, and therefore not one of the things done by them was lawfully done." That was the case. It was always the case. Not magic, not blasphemy, a clerical objection, and clerical objections are the only kind that ever kill anything in this kingdom. If the court agreed, then the well on Tannery Row was an unlawful act, and the bridge at Taro Ford was an unlawful act, and Isel Brandt's sealing was an unlawful act, and all of it could be undone and charged to somebody. To me, in the first instance. Then to 41 people who had written papers, which is the part Tarn wanted, because it makes everybody who ever writes one afraid. He had a second line ready, and he used it well. He said the keeper decides which grievances are true and which wait, and no man in this kingdom holds that power, not even the crown. Then he sat down, and there was a small, polite noise from the benches, and a man on the second row stood up who was not on the papers at all. Aurel Mott was in dark gray with no chain, which is the most expensive thing a man can wear in a room like that. And he began by praising me. He said the keeper has served the registry 11 years without one complaint against his own conduct. He said he had looked personally that morning and found nothing. Then he said gently, "And that is precisely why the crown should relieve him of an object that was never meant to sit in one man's hands." He offered to take the box into the chancery. He said, "Let the chancery hold it. You keep the honor and lose the burden." Then he looked at me properly for the first time and said, "You look tired, Vane." I did look tired. I had slept about 9 hours in 5 days, and my hand was wrapped in linen, and I had a blistered line under my jaw from a sword. That is how the man works, and I want anybody who ever deals with his kind to understand it. He does not accuse you. He agrees with you in public, and then he offers to carry the thing you are dying under. If I said yes, the box goes into a chancery cellar with a proper form and a proper officer, and the papers are read in the order the chancery likes, and the tanneries and the tolls are never mentioned again. If I said no, in that room, in front of the king's bench, then I was a 19-year-old clerk refusing help from the Lord Chancellor because he wanted to keep the power for himself. So, I did not answer that either. I asked the court a question instead, and my voice came out at about the level of a clerk reading out a shelf number, and the usher had to repeat it for the bench. I asked the court, in the flattest voice I own, what a seal proves. 6 words. It is the only question I have ever asked in a court of law, and it is the only one I needed. The Crown Advocate was a woman of about 50, with a wig she clearly hated, and she was the first person in the room to look interested rather than entertained. She said the point is well put and asked whether the keeper had authority for it. I said I had, and I asked leave to have it read, because my voice would not carry to the bench. Then I called Tam Wick, Baker's son, 17 years old, and put my own copy in his hands, and there was a noise from the benches that I enjoyed more than I should have. He read it out. He moved his mouth on the long words the way he does. He got as far as the word attests and mispronounced it and started that line again, and the whole king's bench waited for him. The statute of petitions, the 3rd clause. A seal attests the identity of the petitioner. It does not attest the truth of the petition. Then, the second half of it, which I had found at the small hours of the morning in a volume nobody had opened since the old king. Where identity is otherwise proved to the satisfaction of the officer, the want of a seal shall not void the petition. Tam finished, and looked up, and said sorry about a test, sir, and one of the judges laughed, and had the decency to pretend he had coughed. That is my whole method in one picture. My throat does not work, so a boy who reads by syllables recited the clause that saved 41 people, and it landed harder than any speech I could have made. Tarn was on his feet at once. He said the identity of these petitioners is not proved. They are commoners. Half of them cannot sign their own names. And that was the moment he lost. Although it took another hour to become visible, because he had just told the court that his objection was not about seals at all. Then the bailiffs moved on the box, and I have never worked out whether that was ordered or whether somebody simply decided to be helpful to the chancery. 2 of them, one at each end of the table, and they got their hands under the crate to carry it out of the hall while the argument was still open. I did the only thing available. which was to put both hands on the lid and hold it down, and shout the shortest true thing I could get out of my throat. I said it is entered as evidence, and I said it twice, because the first one did not carry past the table. Read the docket before you lift it. The near bailiff lifted anyway, and the lid came up under my palms, and then went down again hard on my right hand, on the top of the fingers, against the iron band on the rim. I did not let go. That is not courage. It is that my hands were already ruined, and my head had decided the box mattered more than the hand did. The usher shouted the docket number. The bailiff stopped. 2 of my fingers went black by that evening, and stayed black for a month. On the same hand Dask had burned. While a physician of the court was wrapping them at the side of the hall, I asked the clerk to read the docket entry back to me, and I made him say the number twice, and I wrote it in the payment book with my left hand, not out of bravado, because a box that is on the docket cannot be quietly carried into a cellar by a helpful person. And I had just learned that the docket was the only wall I had. Then the court gave me until morning to prove 41 identities, which was meant as a courtesy and was in fact the hardest work of my life to that date. 11 years of the register, and that is what the register is for. Every one of those 41 people existed in it somewhere. Tenancy rolls, apprentice bonds, parish burials, market licenses, militia lists. Oda Brill came in at midnight with 2 lamps and did not ask whether she was needed. Osk had come up from Taro Ford on the carrier's cart and brought the village's own list. Tam read out names and I found them, and Oda pulled the volumes, and Osk swore to the 6 villages in his own hand as the man who had written their papers with them. Nessa Quill, age 12, Tannery Row, entered in the parish register at birth and again in her mother's burial 2 years ago. Verified. When Ardle, tenant of 11 acres at Taro Ford, on the tenancy roll in my own handwriting from 3 years back, with his mark beside the entry. Verified. Iselle Brandt, widow, on the parish relief list, and her landlord's repair allowance in the parish accounts on the facing page, which I entered as well because it was there. Rilla Odd, stable girl, hired at Osley Hall 3 years ago, on the estate wage list which Ivo Tarn himself had signed, and I put that page in front of the court with his signature at the bottom of it. 41 names. 41 trades, 22 who could sign, and 19 who made a mark, and every mark witnessed by 2 people whose own identities were also in the volumes. 3 of them were dead by then, of ordinary things, and I said so on the record rather than let it be found later, and I gave the burial entries. We finished at 7 in the morning, and I had ink to the second knuckle on my left hand, because I could not hold a pen properly with my right. The Crown Advocate went through it for an hour in front of the bench, page by page, and then she said the sentence that ended Tarn's case in 11 words. She said 41 names, 41 trades, all verified, on the Crown's own volumes, by the Crown's own officer. The want of a seal does not void them. Tarn tried the last door. He said the keeper decides which are true, and a man who decides truth for the Crown must hold office by patent. The advocate did not even stand up all the way. She said, by your own filing, the box decides. You cited it in your 3rd paragraph. Do you wish to withdraw your own pleading? He did not. He could not. And the bench struck him from the matter for pleading a case founded on the authority of the thing he was asking them to void. That is a very small sentence to hear read out. In practice, it means a steward with 14 years of practice loses his right to plead before that bench, and the 2 men who paid him watch it happen from the benches. Osley was in an orchard eating apples. Mott sat perfectly still and looked at nobody, and I remember that better than the rest of the day. He had lost a steward, an estate and a tithe in 1 week, and none of it had come out of his own pocket, and he did not move 1 finger while it happened. Then the advocate turned to the bench with her notes already closed, and this is the part I did not see coming and could not have arranged if I had spent a year on it. She said the court will hear the keeper. Then she said it again, differently, without looking at a note, as if it were a thing everybody already called me. The clerk who reads. Nobody had called me anything before that, except keeper of the box, junior scribe, or boy with a crate. It is not much of a title. It was the first one that was not a joke. I got as far as thanking the court, and my voice went out at the second word, and the advocate waited for it, and then read my submission herself, which cost her nothing, and told the room everything. The judgment was 3 lines. The 41 papers stand. The want of a seal does not void a petition where identity is proved. The keeper shall keep a record of every cost taken. That last line was mine. I had asked for it in my submission, in writing, because I had a book with 14 entries in it, and I wanted the Crown to make the book compulsory before somebody made it illegal. This is the only time in my life I have been given exactly what I asked a court for, and I got it because I asked in 9 words at the bottom of a page instead of making a speech about it. Mott caught me in the corridor by the west stairs afterward, on his own, with no clerk, which is how he does the things that matter. He said the court was right, and he was pleased. Then he said, in the tone of a man mentioning the weather, "You need a better form, that is all. Forms are the only mercy in government." I said the form is fine. He said the form is a piece of ruled paper, written out by a village scribe, and the Crown cannot rest a right upon it. And one day, somebody less patient than me will say so. Then he said he would have the Chancery draft something proper, printed and free, at no cost to me or to any petitioner, and put all of it at my disposal by the end of the week. And I thanked him. I stood in that corridor with 2 black fingers and a burned hand and a title that a stranger had given me, and I said, "Thank you, my lord," because there was no other sentence available in a corridor. I keep coming back to that thank you more than I have turned over the pig. It is the exact moment I lost the next 2 months, and it happened while I was being polite. The week after the judgment was the best week I had that year, and I did not notice at the time, which is how those weeks work. 40 complaints read in 7 days. Not one paper burned on its own. Every payment named in the text by the person who wrote it, and every line entered in the book on the day of the reading. A tanner on Tannery Row came to say thank you for his roof, which had been granted the week before, and I took him to see the barn it had come out of and made him look at it. He did not enjoy that. He said he had not asked for a barn to be taken. I said somebody paid for your roof, and now you know his name, and if you ever want to square it with him, that is between the 2 of you. He came back 3 weeks later with 2 days of labor done on that barn, unasked, and I entered it in the book as the first repayment anybody ever made voluntarily. 2 days of a tanner's labor against 1 barn slope. It does not balance, and I did not pretend it balanced. It is still the first line in that book with 2 names on it instead of 1. 9 papers withdrawn that week by their own authors after we read them out loud together, which is a number I am prouder of than the 40. Oda watched me sort the queue by fuse date on the 7th evening, oldest at the top, and then she said the thing I had spent 7 days not saying out loud in that room. She said you read 40 this week. Then she let me be pleased with it for about 2 breaths, and then she said the rest of it. Next week is not 40. I said I know. She said you are 1 man with 2 ruined hands, and this city has 90,000 people in it, and every one of them has something true to say about somebody. Tatter had arrived by then. Gray archive cat, no known owner, no interest in me whatsoever, and a strong preference for sleeping on the oldest paper in the pile. I moved that cat off the queue about 9 times a night for the rest of my life. I never once moved the paper instead, and about a year later that habit saved the city's grain. I fell asleep at the desk on the 7th night with my splinted hand flat on the queue, and woke at 3 because there was noise across the yard. There is a press in the yard behind the Chancery, for proclamations and market notices. It does not run at night. It ran all that night and the night after. I went out and stood in the cold, and watched the light in the shutters, and listened to the plate come down over and over, and I could not think of one lawful reason for it. A printer's boy came out to the pump for water at about 4, and I asked him what they were setting, and he was too tired to lie or to care. He said 1,000, sir. By morning. Free of charge to the public, on the Chancellor's order, and the paper stock is the good linen laid. I said 1,000 of what? He said petitions of grievance, sir. Approved form. Then he took his bucket and went back in. I stood in that yard until my feet went numb, doing the only arithmetic that mattered. 1,000 free forms in a city of 90,000, and a fuse of 7 days on every one that comes back filled. 40 a week is my ceiling. It is not a figure I chose. It is 1 pair of eyes, 1 register, and the time it takes to check a thing properly before you say it out loud. At dawn, the carrier's cart came to the registry door with the first bundles, 500 blank forms delivered to me, with the Chancellor's compliments written on the wrapper in a clerk's beautiful hand. The stock was better than anything the registry has ever been able to buy. Good linen laid, cut square, with a ruled line for the date. I noticed that before I noticed anything else, and I was bitter about it in a way I could not have explained. By 9 in the morning, there were people in the lane filling them in against the wall, because the form asks the questions in a printed order, and it feels official, and official is what everybody has always wanted. By noon, the box would not take any more without somebody pushing them down with a flat hand, and Tam was standing in the doorway, holding a stack that had fallen out, counting under his breath. I opened the top one to read it aloud the way I make everybody do, and I got to the bottom of the printed page. past the 3 questions I had written in a village square. Under the line for the writer's name, there was one more paragraph, set in type too small to read at arm's length, that neither Osk nor I had put there. The small print at the bottom of the Chancellor's beautiful freeform was 1 sentence long, and it was the best piece of drafting I have ever read, and I say that as a man whose whole trade is drafting. It said this: the petitioner consents to reasonable costs being taken to the benefit of the Treasury. Set in type too small to read at arm's length, under the line for the writer's name. It does not deny the box. It does not forbid anything. It does not say one word that a court would strike. It simply tells the box where to take the material from. To the benefit of the Treasury. Which means the cost of putting a thing right no longer falls where the writer chooses. It falls where the crown gains by it, and the crown gains by not paying for anything. And because the writer signed the consent themselves, in their own hand, under their own name, the box treats it as their choice. It is their sentence. It is their place of payment. That is the whole trick. A woman on Cobb Lane wants her landlord's drain fixed. Under my form, the cost comes out of the landlord's yard wall because she wrote it there herself and named it. Under the Chancellor's form, the cost comes out of whatever the Treasury would otherwise have had to buy. The parish pump, the almshouse slate, the market stalls, the public well. The public well, on Tannery Row, the one that 40 families drink from, which the crown would otherwise have to dig and does not have to dig because it already exists. I sat down on the floor of the lower registry with my back against the crate for about a quarter of an hour, and I am not going to pretend that was thinking. It was fright. Because there were about 400 of those forms already filled in and pushed through the slot in 2 days, and everyone carried a fuse of 7 days, and everyone had been signed with a consent by somebody who did not read the small type. If I read them, the poor pay for the poor. If I do not read them, they fire anyway on the 7th day in the crudest wording available, and the poor still pay, and nobody chooses anything. A court can strike a clause. It takes 6 weeks, and there are 400 fuses burning, and the Chancery can print a new clause in 1 night. I had been beaten by that arithmetic once already, and I was not going to lose to it twice. I went to the archive instead, and I was not looking for the clause when I went, and that should be clear. I went down those stairs looking for the box itself and where it had been. Here is the thing I had not asked since the day it was handed to me, and I had not asked it because I had been too busy being nearly killed by it. Where had it been for 40 years? And who put it there? Everything in the Chancery moves on paper. If that crate came down those stairs, a man signed for it, and the signature is in the transfer volumes, and the transfer volumes are in Cabinet 9. I took 2 witnesses, because I am not an idiot, and because Mott had spent a week teaching me what happens to a man who acts alone with a good motive. Perrin Lowe, the smith from Taro Ford who had put the eyes in the ferry hull, was in the city selling ironwork. Tamwick came from the bread cart. Both of them signed the inventory sheet before we touched a door. I said, Cabinet 9, transfers, 40 years back. Open it by inventory and sign that we did, and note the hour, and note that nothing was removed except by entry. That sentence is the reason I am not in a cell. Everything I did in that cellar was in the Chancery's own procedure, and the Chancery's own procedure is the only thing Oral Mott could not simply repeal in an afternoon. We were an hour into it, 3 rooms deep under the west wing where the floor goes wet. Tam held the lamp, Perrin wrote down volume numbers, and I had my head and shoulders into the bottom shelf of Cabinet 9. Then the shelf above me came down, and it did not creak first, and there was no warning of any kind except a sound like a knuckle cracking somewhere over my left shoulder. It came down in 3 parts, and about 200 pounds of bound ledgers came with it, and the corner of the frame caught the back of my head as it went past. I would like to be accurate about this because it is the closest I have come to dying for that box, and it was not glorious. I was face down on a wet floor under a heap of somebody else's paperwork, with my arms trapped and my mouth full of 40-year-old dust. Tam got the lamp clear and started hauling volumes off my back. Perrin Lowe got a hand under the frame and held it, and he is a smith and he could hold it, and he told Tam where to pull. Then Oda Brill was on the stairs with a second lamp, and she did not shout, and she did not ask if I was hurt. She said, "Do not breathe yet, wait for the dust." It is the most useful sentence anybody has ever said to me. I stopped trying to breathe and lay still and let it settle over me. Dust goes in dry and sits, and you cannot cough it up because coughing needs air you do not have. They got me out with a cut across the scalp, a knee that did not work for a week, and my splinted hand mercifully underneath me. I sat up against the wet wall and looked at the shelf. It had not fallen. The brackets were sound. What had failed was the pin at the left end, and the pin had been out for a long time. Perrin Lowe looked at it for about 10 seconds and said this was not lately. He said there is no rust in the hole. The pin came out when this cabinet was last moved, and nobody put it back. I asked when a cabinet like that would last have been moved. Oda Brill was standing at the bottom of the stairs with the lamp in both hands, and she answered before I had finished the question. She said 40 years ago. Then she said, in the same voice, I carried it down here myself. I was 19. He told me it was clutter. She said it again, louder, and towards Perrin and Tam rather than towards me. She was putting it in front of witnesses on purpose, because she had waited 40 years, and she would not confess it to one man in a cellar, where it could be denied later. She said for the record that in the reign of the old king she was the junior archivist of the Chancery, aged 19, and that she was told to take a petition box from the West Hall to the transfer cellar. She said she has known where it was every day for 40 years, and she never once opened the lid, and she never once told anybody, and that this is the thing she will answer for. I asked why. That is the only question I asked, and I asked it badly, sitting on a wet floor bleeding into my own collar. She said because I was 19 and I wanted to be the archivist. Then she said, and because I did not believe the stories, and by the time I believed them I had been silent for 20 years and silence gets heavier. I did not forgive her. I am putting that on the record because the ballad version has me taking her hand in a cellar and saying something generous. What I actually said was that I needed the docket she had been given, and I said it in my filing voice, and she nodded as if that was the answer she deserved and went and got the shelf list. 3 weeks later, I put her name on the service roll as the first of the 9, and I never once discussed her 40 years with her again. That is what I had instead of forgiveness. It is not the same thing, and it worked better. The docket was in the second volume Tam had been holding when the shelf came down, which he had put on the floor without looking at it. It had been 6 inches from my head the entire time. One petition box from the West Hall to the transfer cellar, by order, with the date in the margin in a clerk's hand. Then the signature at the bottom, A. Mott, under secretary. 40 years old, in a hand that had not yet learned to be beautiful. Same slope, same short bar on the letter T as the compliments written on the wrapper of 500 free forms 2 days earlier. He had not been handed the box to deal with, and nobody had ordered him to store it. He put it away himself, deliberately, when he was young and held no rank at all. 40 years ago, he looked at an object that grants any true grievance for nothing, and he understood at once what that does to a kingdom which farms its tolls. And he had it carried down into a cellar by a girl of 19 who wanted to be the archivist. Then he grew up in that chancery and bought the roads, and one morning 11 relics were handed out, and the 11th was carried up out of that cellar and given to a junior scribe as a joke. I have wondered ever since whether he chose me because he thought I would fail with it, or because he needed it back in the light, where he could see it. I have never decided, and he never told me. What I did next is the least dramatic thing in this whole account, and the most important one, and every young reader I have trained since has argued with me about it. I did not confront him. I had a docket with his signature on it, and I put it away. 3 attested copies, made that night, signed by Perrin Low and Tamwick and the parish clerk of St. Ardo, and each copy left in a different building. 1 copy stayed in the registry, 1 went to Osk and Terrowford, and 1 went into a box of parish accounts at the almshouse. Distribution of risk I wrote on each wrapper, and I did not use that document for 8 months. Because a docket in a cellar is not a weapon, it is a fact. A fact becomes a weapon only in a room that must answer it, and there was no such room yet, and I had 400 fuses burning upstairs. So I went back up those stairs with a bandaged head and a knee that would not bend properly, and I put the docket away in my coat, and I went and dealt with the forms instead. Not by law, not by argument, by line. I stood in the lane outside my own door for 2 days, with the queue in front of me, and did the one thing the clause could not survive. I read the small print out loud to every single person before they handed the paper in, and then I told them what it meant in the plainest words I have. This line says the cost comes out of the Crown's pocket instead of your landlord's. The Crown's pocket is the public well, the almshouse roof, the parish pump. It means your neighbors pay for your justice. Strike it out yourself if you do not want that. Then I gave them my own pen, and I stood back with my hands behind me, because I could not strike it for them, and I have not once been tempted to. A fishwife took the pen and went through the paper with the nib, then demanded a fresh form and struck the line neatly on the second one, and told the whole lane what she thought of free stationery. 42 people could not read at all, and for them Tam read the clause out, twice, slowly, and then they made a mark against the strike, and 2 witnesses signed beside it. 118 forms diffused fused in 2 days, and that was the number in the book. 118 people who took a pen and cut a sentence out of a document a chancellor had printed for them, free of charge. And this is the thing that mattered more than the count. Every one of them found out that a signature is theirs, and that a printed line is not a law, and that they were entitled to cross something out. Mott came to watch on the second afternoon. No clerk, no escort, standing at the corner by the gate for about 20 minutes with his hands behind his back. I finished the woman I was with before I looked up. Then he walked over and said pleasantly, "You went into the archive." I said, "By inventory, with witnesses, nothing removed except by entry, and the hour noted at the top of the sheet, your own rule, my lord, in your own chancery." And he stopped smiling. It is a very small thing, and I doubt 3 people in this kingdom have ever seen it. The pleasantness went off his face, like a lamp being turned down, and for about 2 seconds he looked at me the way you look at a ledger error. Then he put it back on. He said the inventory is in excellent order, and he meant it, and that is the most frightening sentence anybody has ever said to me. He did not ask what I had found. That is how I knew he knew exactly what I had found, and that he had decided, standing at that gate, to stop being patient. Then, a boy came up the lane at a run from the direction of the bread row, and I knew before he arrived, because runners in that quarter never bring anything good. 41 papers had gone off by themselves while I was in the cellar and in the lane. Not the new forms, the old queue, the papers I had sorted by fuse date and then abandoned for 2 days to deal with the printed ones. 41 of them, all at the same hour of the same afternoon, all executed in the crudest wording their sentences allowed, with nobody at all choosing where any of it came from. A drain on Cobb Lane went in the correct direction at last, and took a doorstep with it. 2 fences moved about a yard each. A stable door that a carter had complained about for 9 days sealed itself shut, with the horse still inside it, and 4 men had to take the hinges off to get the animal out. Most of it was small, and I have the list, and I can still say it in order. And one of them took the west wall out of the Wick house on the bread row. Nobody was under it, and that goes in the same breath, because for about 200 paces of running I did not know that, and I have not forgotten what that felt like. A woman 2 doors down had written truthfully that the flour dust from the Wick bakehouse was ruining her lungs, and she was right, and she had been right for 4 years. Her wording was the crudest available, and nobody had read it to her, and nobody had helped her name a place of payment, because I had been in a cellar under a shelf. So the box did the simplest thing the words allowed. It took out the wall the flue and the mixing bench sit against, and the dust stopped because the bakehouse stopped. Tam Wick's family, whose son had walked 9 miles to learn to read for me, lost the west wall of their house and their trade with it on a Tuesday because I chose an archive over a queue. I got there and started pulling stone with my one good hand, and Perrin Lowe arrived and did the actual work. And Tam's mother stood in the yard and would not go inside the part that was still standing. She let me dig for about 10 minutes. Then she told me to leave it, and she said, "You will lose the fingers you have left." I said I would pay for it. She asked with what, in a tone that was not cruel, and I did not have an answer, because I had 2 rooms below the street and a posting worth £9 a year. So I used the one thing I have. I sat on the doorstep of a broken house and made an inventory. Every item out of that room by name, and what it was worth, and who witnessed the count. 1 flour bin, ash, cracked. 1 mixing bench, oak, salvageable. 1 proving cloth. 9 baking tins. 1 kitchen chair with a burn on the arm where the old man used to put his pipe down. I put the whole of it in the payment book under the flour dust complaint, with the writer's name and the date and the hour, and then I signed it and gave Tam's mother the page number. She looked at the number and said, "What is that for?" I said it is so that when there is money, this is what is owed, and to whom, and in what order, and so that nobody can decide later that it did not happen. She did not thank me. She put the page number in her apron pocket, which is where people in that quarter keep the things they intend to hold somebody to. Tam came to work the next morning with flour still on his sleeves, from a bakehouse with no west wall, and I have never in my life been so unable to look at somebody. He sat down on the stool across the desk and said what founded everything that came after, and he said it as if it were obvious. He said you cannot read them all, not with 2 hands like that, and not with 200 coming a week. So teach 8 more of me, and do it now, and stop saying you will. I said the fuse does not care how many of us there are. He said 9 of us can read 9 at once, and 41 would not have gone off if there had been 9 of us. He was right, and it had cost his family a wall for me to hear it, and I have never been able to decide whether this is the shape of a service being founded or the shape of a debt. I said, before we read one more paper, we write the rules down and everybody signs them personally, in their own hand, with their own name. He said, what rules? I said, the ones we have learned by breaking things. Read it aloud before the box hears it. Test the substance and not the shape. Never leave a fuse unwatched. Ask who else eats from the man you are about to break. Then I took a clean sheet and numbered it page 1 of 1 and wrote nothing else on it, because I wanted the 9 of them to write those rules themselves and not receive them from me. We had 9 names by the end of the week: a fishwife, a parish clerk, Perrin Lowe's cousin, Oda Brill, Tam, 3 from the 6 villages, sent up by Osk, and a young man from the Chancery's own copying room who came to me on the 4th day and asked to be considered. His name was Hald Prim. He was 31, he read faster than anybody I have ever met, and his letters were better than mine. I liked him immediately, and I never said in public that he was right about the thing he was right about, and he was right. On the first evening, with all 9 of them in the cold room and the empty rule sheet on the desk, he asked the question that split the service 2 months later. He asked it politely, with his hand flat on the empty sheet, and he asked it in front of the other 8. He said, who gave a scribe the right to decide whose truth waits? 9 people in a room with no stove, in the last week of autumn, with a blank sheet of paper on the desk between us and about 600 unread papers in a crate against the wall. I had thought I would stand up and give them the rules. I had them written out in my head on the way down the stairs, in order, numbered, the way I write everything. I got as far as saying that they were not judges. Then I said the sentence I actually meant, and it is the only one of mine that has survived into every reading room in this kingdom. I said it looking at the crate and not at them. You are not judges. You are the last person who can still stop a sentence before the box hears it. Then Hald Prim asked his question politely, with his hand flat on the empty sheet, and all of the thing went a different way for 2 hours. He said, who gave a scribe the right to decide whose truth waits? Then he sat back and waited, and 8 people looked at the table, and one of them looked at me. I said nobody, and I said it too quickly, and he did not let it go. And I have been grateful about that ever since, even when it cost me 3 warehouses. He said there is a widow on Cobb Lane whose paper has been in that crate for 9 days. He said it is true, and it is small, and it has waited because you were at a court, and then in a cellar, and then in a lane. Then he said the part that landed. He said, meanwhile, you read a bridge because a farmer's fuse ran out first. That is an order of business vein. You made it. You call it a fuse date. It is a seal, and you made it out of yourself. Nobody in that room looked at me for a moment, because he was right, and every one of them had thought some version of it and had been too polite or too new to say it out loud. That is the argument, set down properly and not made stupid, because the man who made it later cost me 3 buildings and a reader, and he still was not wrong about the shape of the problem. If one man decides what is read first, then that man is a seal, not a wax one. A worse one, because a wax seal at least has a price list and everybody knows where to buy it. I had 2 answers, and I gave the weak one first, which is that a fuse is a fact and not a preference, and that reading the oldest paper first is not a judgment about whose grievance matters. He said the fuse date is a fact, and the choice to sort by it is a preference, and that is exactly true, and I did not have a rebuttal, and I stopped trying to find one. So I went at it the only way that has ever worked for me in a room where I am losing. I stopped defending it and gave the room the pen. I said, we are not going to settle this by me being right. We are going to write the rules down tonight. All 9 of us, and everybody signs personally, in their own hand, with their own name, and if you cannot sign it, you do not read. It took until about 3 in the morning. It is the best night's work I have ever been part of, and I wrote almost none of it. Tam Wick gave Rule 1, and he gave it in his own words, and it is still Rule 1 on the wall of every reading room. Read the sentence out loud before the box hears it. The fishwife, whose name was Bettany Crow, and who could not read 4 months earlier, gave Rule 2. And Rule 2 is the one that has saved the most lives. She said it once, and then she said it again while Oda wrote it down, and she made Oda read it back to her to be sure of the wording. Ask who else eats from the man you are about to break. Let me be clear that this did not come from me. It came from a woman who had spent 9 years buying fish from a man everybody in her lane hated, and who knew what happens to a street when the man everybody hates goes under. Rule 3 came from Oda Brill. No paper leaves the queue unwatched, and the fuse date goes on the outside of every bundle in a hand that anybody can read. Rule 4 was mine, and it is the dullest. The place of payment must be named in the text by the writer, and if the writer will not name it, the paper is not read until they do or until the fuse decides. Rule 5 was proposed by a parish clerk at about 2 in the morning and adopted without dissent, and it is that no cat is permitted on the queue. Tatter had spent that entire meeting asleep on the oldest bundle and had been removed twice and had returned twice and was asleep on it again when the rule was passed. Then Hald asked what the order of reading is, since we had all agreed that somebody has to choose. And this is where I won the argument I could not win by talking. I did not choose. The room chose. 8 of them, out loud, one at a time, and I made every one of them say it in their own words, and I wrote it down as they said it. Not by rank, not by pity, not by who shouts loudest in the lane, and not by who brings bread to the door. By the day the thing will happen anyway, whatever any of us does. Then Bettany Crow added the part nobody expected, which is that if a paper is going to be read late, somebody walks to the writer's house and tells them so, and tells them why, to their face. This is the rule that made the service something people trusted. Not the reading, the walking to the door to say your paper is 9th, and here is the reason. 8 of the 9 put their names on that sheet before dawn, and 2 of them had to be shown how to shape the letters. Hald Prim did not sign it. He was not dramatic about it. He said it is a good sheet and a fair meeting, and I do not accept the last part, and I will not sign a thing I do not accept. Then he asked for a copy, and I gave him one, because a man who is arguing with you openly is worth more than a man who is not, and because refusing would have made the rules look like mine again. I gave a copy of my own doctrine to the man who took it to the chancellor 11 days later. I did that with my own hands, and I would do it again. And Oda has told me twice that this is the single stupidest sentence I have ever said out loud. For 11 days after that meeting, the service worked better than it has ever worked since, and I did not know at the time that I was living in the good part. 9 readers, 3 shifts, 2 of them always on the queue, and 1 always out at a door telling somebody their paper was 9th. 40 papers on the first day, 60 on the third. Not one fired on its own. Not one. 11 days, with about 600 fuses running in a crate in a cold room, and not one of them reached the 7th day, unread. We read 190 in 11 days. 206 were still in the crate, and the oldest of those had 4 days on it, and for the first time since the ceremony the pile was going down instead of up. And the sound of that room changed. 9 people reading aloud slowly, at 4 desks, and stopping each other on nouns. What does she mean by ruined? Whose wall is nearest? Who else eats from him? The widow on Cobb Lane got read on the 11th day, which was still late, and Bettany Crow walked there herself on the 4th day to tell her why, and the widow gave her a bun, and told her the fuse dates were sensible. I have that in the book. Not the bun, the visit, with the date and the name, because a reader walking to a door is a cost too, in hours, and I had started counting hours by then. Then the beam over the main desk came down, and it came down because the service had outgrown its building, and I had not thought about the building at all. The lower registry has 1 long desk under a beam that carries the floor of the room above, and we had hung 2 extra lamps from that beam because 9 people cannot read by 1. Wet oak, 40 years of coal smoke, and 2 lamp brackets driven in by a clerk with no idea what he was doing, which is to say, by me. It cracked at about the 2nd hour of the evening shift, with a noise like a shot, and the beam dropped about a foot and hung, and 1 lamp came off it and went into the queue. Bettany Crow was under the near end of it. She got out because Perrin Lowe's cousin, a carter named Dow, put his shoulder under the beam and took the weight of a floor on his back for as long as it took her to move. The lamp set fire to the top of 3 bundles before I got my coat on it. Somebody shouted hands, get your hands off the table, and everybody did, because a burning lamp on a desk of paper is not something you reason with. 3 papers scorched, none destroyed. 1 reader's sleeve alight and out again in a second, and Dow with a back that gave him trouble for a year afterward. And I stood in that room with my coat smoking, and understood something about the shape of what we were doing that had not occurred to me once. The building was the bottleneck, not the reading, not the rules. 1 room, 1 desk, 1 beam, 1 crate, 9 people, 600 papers, and a city of 90,000 outside the door. I wrote it in the book that night. Reading house required, 4 rooms at least, cost unknown. And under it, because I had learned that much, the words nothing granted here. We moved to the old wool exchange on Fenner Street 11 days later, because the guild had gone under 2 winters ago, and the Crown had the lease, and the Crown owed me nothing but the Crown's advocate liked me. 4 rooms, 6 desks, a stone floor, no beam over anybody's head, and a counter at the front where anybody could come in and read the payment book without asking permission. That counter was the best decision I have ever made. It has been copied in 20 towns, and I did not think of it, Bettany Crow said if it is open to us, it should be open at a counter, like fish. Then Hald Preem read 11 papers in a row in the second room on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at Fenner Street measuring desks. His side of it deserves to be given accurately. He did not do it for money, and he did not do it to hurt anybody. And I have never believed that Mott had bought him at that point. He did it because he had been sitting in a room for 11 days watching true grievances wait, and he decided he had a duty to the people the rules were making wait. He took the 11 oldest that had no named place of payment, the ones we were holding back under Rule 4 until their writers could be found, and he read them straight through in about an hour. All 11 were true. That is the part that people forget when they tell it. Not one of them was a lie, and not one of them was malicious. Nobody was hurt. That goes in the same breath as the rest of it. Because nothing here is worth anything if I let you think the box killed people that day. It does not do that. It takes material. It took 3 warehouses on Cutter Row, because a granted sentence with no named place of payment takes the nearest suitable structures, and Cutter Row is 1 street back from Fenner Street, where we had just moved. Not looted, not burned, dismantled, cleanly, course by course, into the road, over about 15 minutes, while 40 people stood in the street and watched it happen, and nobody could think of a single thing to do. 1 belonged to a rope merchant. 1 was a bonded store with the custom seal still on the door, and 1 belonged to a man named Kestrel Hone, whose father had built it and whose whole trade was inside it. He was standing in the doorway of my new reading room within the hour with his own ledger under his arm, and his hands were shaking, and he was entirely in the right. Behind him in the street, the roof timbers of his father's warehouse were stacked in the road in courses, sorted by length, which somehow made it worse than a fire would have been. He said that was 40 years of my father's work, and I never wrote you anything, and not once have I complained about anybody in my life. And there is no clever answer to that. There is no procedure that makes it better in the doorway. I said his name back to him, and I asked him to come in and sit down, and I opened the book on the counter. Then the room did the thing I had spent 11 days building it to do, and all the point of what happened next is that it did it without me, and in front of the man we had ruined. Kestrel Hone asked who told Hald Prim that he could, and Tam Wick, 17 years old, with flour still on his sleeves, answered him before I could. Tam did not raise his voice, and he did not apologize for anything. He said nobody told him he could. It is the whole point of the paper you are standing on. He pointed at the rule sheet nailed by the door, with 8 names on it and 1 blank line, and he said the blank line is his, and he read anyway, and that is why we are all standing here. Kestrel Hone read that sheet twice. Then he asked, in a completely different voice, whether he could have a copy of it, and whether the man who broke it would be put out of the service. I said that depends on the 8 names on that sheet, and not on me, and that we would meet on it that evening, and that he was entitled to be present at the meeting since it was his warehouse. He came. He sat at the back with his ledger on his knees and watched 9 people argue about their own rules for 3 hours. And at the end of it, he said it was the first meeting about his own ruin that anybody had ever let him into. Hall did not defend himself much. He said all of them were true. All of them were waiting. I am not the one who kept them waiting. Then Bettany Crow put Rule 2 to him straight, in front of everybody, and asked him which families were fed out of that warehouse. He had no answer, because he had not asked it, and 3 of them were. He walked out that evening with a copy of the rules under his coat, and he did not come back. And I did not chase him, because chasing a man is not a procedure, and I had nothing to charge him with. He had broken a sheet of paper that 8 people signed, and he had not signed. That is not a crime. It is worse than a crime for our purposes, because it means the only thing that binds a reader is whether they choose to be bound. What I did instead was write the restitution schedule for 3 warehouses, by inventory, in one night, with Kestrel Hone reading over my shoulder and correcting my valuations twice. 206 items, names, owners, condition, estimated value, and the order in which they would be repaid when there was anything to repay them with. There was nothing to repay them with. My posting is £9 a year. That schedule sat in the book for 4 months with nothing against it, and every one of those 4 months I turned the page and looked at it. Kestrel Hone came in twice a week for those 4 months and read his own page at the counter and went away again without saying anything to anybody. He never once shouted at me, and I would have preferred it if he had. Then the count for that week, which I read out at the counter on the Sunday, the way we now do everywhere. 406 papers read at Fenner Street, 9 readers, none burned. 3 papers withdrawn by writers who came in, heard their own wording read back at the counter, and took them home to think about, which I count as the best number on the page. Bettany Crow read her 100th paper that week and could not read a word 4 months before. She asked me to write her name on the roll in her own presence so she could watch it being done. And Nessa Quill came to Fenner Street on the day we opened, with Tobin, and stood at the counter looking at the rule sheet for a long time. She waited until the counter was clear, which took her about an hour, and then she asked whether she could be one of them. She said I write slow, as if she were confessing to something. I said slow is every part of the job, and then I said the thing I have gone over about 4,000 times since. Come back when you are older. She did not argue. She said all right, and she read the rule sheet out loud to Tobin, twice, and got every word of it, and then took him home because he was coughing again. I heard that cough across 4 rooms, and I noted that the boy had a cough in the same part of my head where I keep the fact that a gutter on Cobb Lane needs seeing to, and then I went back to the counter. I entered the whole of that week in the book on the Sunday, and I remember being about as content as I have ever been. 4 rooms, 9 names, 406, a counter anybody can read. Then a man came in from the lane with a list in his hand, and he stood at the counter and waited until I looked up, and he was not angry, which is what frightened me. He put a paper on the counter and turned it round so that it faced me, and that is what you do when you want somebody to read a thing rather than take it. It was 1 line in a careful hand on good paper that somebody had bought for the purpose. It said the truth of that box has ruined us. Under it, in a different hand, were 26 addresses, and beside each address the name of the person who had never written us anything at all. Cutter Row was on that list 3 times. Isel Brandt's landlord was on it. Halbert Pruitt, who had lost 7 paving stones out of his yard on my first night, was the 4th name down. I read the sentence out loud. By Rule 1, standing at my own counter with my hands flat on either side of it, and the room went quiet behind me, because everybody in it heard what I heard. It is true. Every word of it is true, and it is written by the people it is true about, and the fuse on it was already 3 days old when it reached my counter. 26 households on one list, in one hand, on good paper, and not one of those households had ever written us a single word about anything. The man at the counter was a cooper called Fen Aldrett from the top of Cutter Row, and he had made that list himself, going door to door for 4 days with a borrowed pen. He said 26 houses. None of us wrote to you. Then he put his finger on the paper and said, and this line is true, and you know it is, and I am told you have to read it out loud. So I read it. Rule 1 is Rule 1, and it has no exception for the days when the sentence is pointing at the man behind the counter. I read it out at my own counter with my hands flat on either side of it, and the 4 rooms behind me went quiet, and I heard all of shape of the thing arrive while my own voice was still going. It said the truth of that box has ruined us. 7 words, in the middle of a clean sheet, with 26 addresses under them in a second hand. It is true. That is what nobody who tells this part ever wants to sit with. It is not exaggeration, and it is not spite, and it is not a lie told by a rich man. 26 households were poorer that autumn because of things that had been granted through my hands, and not one of those households had asked for any of it. Halbert Pruitt, 7 paving stones, my first night. Isel Brandt's landlord, 1 barn slope, the church of the warden, a tithe barn roof. 3 warehouses on Cutter Row that Hald Prim read in an hour. I could say the list without opening the book by then, in order, with the page numbers, and I have not once been able to decide whether that is diligence or something closer to a sickness. 2 doorsteps, 9 fence posts, a stable door taken off its hinges, a bakehouse west wall that took the trade of the family whose son taught himself to read for me. I had every one of them in the book, with dates and names and page numbers, because I had started that book on the first night for exactly this reason. And a book is not a roof. Then Oda Brill, who had been counting on her fingers behind me while I read, put it in the way that made it urgent instead of merely terrible. She said it quietly from behind my left shoulder, in the voice she uses for facts. What is the nearest suitable material to that sentence? I looked up at the ceiling of the room I was standing in, at 4 rooms of the old wool exchange on Fenner Street with 6 desks and a counter and 9 readers in it. The complaint says the truth of that box has ruined us. The box was in that building. The reading room stood about 40 feet from it, and it was the only building in the kingdom that existed because of that box. It was going to pay with us. Not with the crown, not with Mott, with the desks and the counter and the roof over the queue, and the queue with 600 fuses in it underneath. I said it out loud because in that room we say things out loud. I said the nearest suitable material to that sentence is this building. It will pay with us. Nobody argued with the reading. What one of them did say, and I will not put his name to it because he was tired and frightened and he was right to say it, was that we could call it exaggeration. He said, say it is not true in substance. Say ruined is too strong a word for 26 households who are poorer but alive. say it, and the box does nothing, and we all go back to work. And that was the story standing on the counter in front of me in one sentence, and everybody in the 4 rooms was looking at me. Because he was offering me the thing I had spent my whole life refusing to have. The power to decide that a true grievance is not true, because it is inconvenient to the office that would have to pay for it. I said no, and I said it fast. And then I made myself say the rest of it slowly, because the rest of it is the only argument I have ever had that matters. I said if I can call a true sentence false to save my own roof, then that box is mine and not theirs. That is the day we become the chancery. There is no other day. It is that one. Tamwick wrote that on the sheet by the door as Rule 6 while I was still speaking, and he did not ask anybody, and it has been Rule 6 ever since. Then the roof started, because the fuse on that paper had been running for 3 days before it ever reached my counter, and I had used up most of what was left standing there being principled. The first slate came off the south pitch and went through the window of the second room, and the second one caught me above the eyebrow on the way past the counter. Scalps and brows bleed. It went into my eye, and I could not see out of that side for the rest of the afternoon, and I have a white line through the eyebrow to this day. Tam got the room out. Out, everyone out. Take the queue, leave the chairs, and 9 people carried 600 papers into Fenner Street in armfuls, while the roof came off course by course over their heads. Not a hurricane. A dismantling. Slates stacked themselves in the road in courses, sorted, the way you do it if you mean to use them again, which is exactly what the box was doing. I stood in the street with blood running into my right eye and the payment book under my arm, and I had 4 minutes at the outside, and I have never worked faster in my life. This is what I had to work with. The box grants the sentence, and the material comes from the nearest suitable place, unless the writer names one. Fen Aldrich had named nothing, because nobody had helped him write it. I could not write on his paper, not a word, not a comma. I cannot write for a petitioner, and that rule has never bent for me once, not that day, and not since. But there is one thing I can do that nobody had ever needed to do before, and I did it standing in a street with a bleeding eyebrow. I can offer the material myself, in writing, in my own name, as the owner of the property offered, and I can put that offer in front of the petitioner and ask him to accept it. It is not a wording change. It is a conveyance. It is the dullest instrument in the whole of the law, and I had drafted about 400 of them for other men in 11 years. I wrote it on the back of the restitution schedule for the warehouses, in the street, with the book on my knee. The house on Vell Street, 2 rooms, a stair, the yard behind, and everything in it. Then I read it out to Fen Aldrich, out loud, the way I make everybody do. And I said, if you accept this in writing, then the cost comes off my roof and not off yours or theirs. He asked whose house it was. I said mine. He asked what was in it. I said my father's copies of 40 years of other people's petitions, and a bed, and a chair, and about 9 pounds of firewood. He said, that is not enough to cover 26 houses. I said no, it is not. It covers this granting and nothing else, and you and I both know that the 26 is a different account and it stays open. He signed. Then he said the sentence that has kept me steady on the bad nights since, and he said it in the flat voice of a man doing arithmetic rather than being kind. He said, I have been to 4 courts about this street in 9 years, and you are the first man who has offered me something out of his own pocket instead of a form. I read the sentence again with the conveyance attached, standing in Fenner Street, with the slates going back onto the roof behind me course by course as fast as they had come off. And 2 miles away, on Vell Street, my father's house came apart in about a quarter of an hour, and the stone of it went into the roof of a reading room, and the roof beams went into the walls of a warehouse on Cutter Row. Kestrel Hone got the middle third of his father's warehouse back that afternoon out of my house, and he did not know why until the following morning. And he came to the counter and asked me if it was true, and I said yes, and he sat down on the step outside. 26 households got their restitution by inventory over that week, in materials, not coin. Doorsteps back, fence posts back, a stable door rehung. Halbert Pruitt got 7 paving stones, and he was the last on the list, and he made a point of counting them. The bakehouse west wall went back that same day, and Tamwick's mother watched it happen from the yard with her hands over her mouth, and she still had the page number in her apron pocket. I did not have anywhere to sleep, which I had not thought about at all until about 10 that night, when the work stopped. Oda found me at the counter with the book open, and she did not offer me a bed, which I was grateful for because she knew I would not have taken it. What she said instead was that my father had kept a copy of every petition he ever wrote for anybody in that house for 40 years, and that they had all gone into a roof. Then she said, "And now you keep every cost you ever took in one book on a counter." She said it as a fact and not as a comfort, and it is the closest thing to comfort I have ever got from her. I slept at the reading room from that night on a bench in the third room, with the crate about 9 feet away and the fuse dates chalked on the outside of every bundle. 9 readers took turns bringing me food for a week without once saying that was what they were doing. Bethany Crow left fish, Oda left bread and a candle. Tam left a bun on the open page of the ledger. In the morning, I walked to Vel Street to see the lot, because I had learned by then that you have to go and look at the thing you have spent. It is about 20 feet by 30. My mother's chalk marks were still on the yard wall, which had not been taken because it belonged to the neighbors, showing my height at 7 and at 9 and at 11. I stood there for about 10 minutes. Then I went back and opened the counter, because there were 19 people in the lane and a queue does not care where you slept. That is when I did the second thing that mattered that week. And it was not brave, and it was not clever, and it changed the shape of the whole service. I put the payment book on the counter, open, for anybody to read, and I left it there permanently. And I told the room that from that day it is open to any person who walks in, without asking, without a reason, and without me being present. Every line, including the bridge, including the wick wall, including the 3 warehouses and the man who read them, including my own house, the day I paid it. Bethany Crow asked whether that was wise, and she asked it kindly, because half the entries in that book are mistakes with my own name written against them. I said that is exactly why. A ledger that only shows the good pages is a proclamation. A ledger that shows what a man broke is a ledger, and a ledger is the only thing anybody has ever been able to hold me to. By the end of that week, there were people in that room every day who had never written a complaint in their lives, and who came in to read the book at the counter, like a market notice. A boy of about 11 asked whether he could copy it out for practice, and I said yes and paid him a penny a page, and I have kept that arrangement running with somebody's child ever since. His fair copy of that book is the one that went to the second reading room when we opened in Belhurst, in a child's round hand, with the mistakes copied out exactly as they stood, including mine. And that is how the Chancery got a printed list of every mistake I have ever made, in my own hand, free of charge. From a counter, I put it on myself. The decree came 9 days later, on a Thursday, nailed to the door of the reading room before I was awake, with a copy carried to every reading table in the districts. It was drafted beautifully, and I read it 3 times at the counter, and I could not find one line in it I would have written differently if I had been asked to draft it for the crown myself. No keeper shall order, delay, or select among lawful petitions. All petitions shall be read in the order in which they are received. And that is the whole of it, and it is the whole weapon. It does not attack the box. It does not attack the rules. It does not name me at all. It abolishes the queue. And it quoted my own book. In the preamble, with the page numbers, it cited Cutter Row and the wall of the Wick House and the almshouse near Miss at Taro Ford as evidence that a keeper's selection had caused harm. Every single one of those entries was true, and I had written them myself. And I had put them on a counter where anybody could read them. Oda said quietly that he had used my honesty as a brief. I said yes. Then I said the honest thing, which is that if I had hidden them, he would have used the hiding instead, and that would have been worse and would have been fair. What the decree does in practice is simple. It means that when a paper arrives with no place of payment named, and its writer cannot be found, we must read it anyway, in arrival order, and let the nearest suitable structure pay. It means a man with a printing press can decide what gets destroyed, by deciding what order things arrive in, and there is no lawful way for a reader to hold a paperback. It means Hald Prim was made the law of this kingdom 9 days after he walked out of my reading room, and he had not even had to argue for it. Nessaquil came to the reading room that evening with a blanket over her arm, because word had gone round Tannery Row that the keeper had given his house away, and was sleeping on a bench like a man in a poorhouse. She put it on the bench without ceremony, and then stood at the counter with her chin about level with the top of it, and asked the question she had come to ask. She said it without any lead-up, the way she says everything. Who pays for my well now? Not who paid. Who pays in the present, as if the account were still running. I said somebody always did. Halbert Pruitt paid for it, 7 stones, on the first night, and he never wrote a word to anybody. All I have ever done is write their names down so that it is not invisible. She thought about that for a while. Then she asked whether Halbert Pruitt had got his stones back, and I said yes, that week, and she nodded as if a sum had come out even. Tobin was with her and he was coughing, and it was worse than it had been at Osley, and he was doing the thing children do where they cough facing away from you so nobody makes a fuss. Nessa told him to sit down and he sat down. She told him not to talk in the cold and he did not. She has always been about 40 years old. I gave him a copper for sweeping the 4th room, which he did badly and with enormous ceremony, and he negotiated for custody of Tatter on the grounds that the cat preferred him. He was right about that. The cat did prefer him, and after everything else that happened, and it is the detail I find hardest to write down, they went home. I went back to the counter. All of it, start to finish, and I have gone over it 4,000 times, and there was nothing in that evening that told me anything, except that a boy had a cough in a cold autumn. The 9 readers met that night on the decree, and I expected to lose at least 3 of them, because the decree took away the thing they had built with their own hands. Not one of them left. What they did instead was change the shape of all of the service in about 2 hours, and again I contributed almost nothing except the arithmetic. Bethany Crow said, if we cannot choose the order, we teach the words. Before they ever reach the box, every lane, every week, at a table, like the villages. So we opened the wording clinics. 20 of them in 20 districts, 2 evenings a week, 1 reader and 1 volunteer at each, with the 3 questions on a board and free-ruled paper. What broke? How you measure it? What may be taken to pay for putting it right? The same 3 questions off a trestle table in a village square, painted on 20 boards. The theory is simple. If the decree forbids us to hold a paper back, then the only place left to work is before the paper exists, in a lane with the person who is about to write it. It worked. In 11 days, the proportion of papers arriving with a named place of payment went from about 1 in 6 to about 2 in 3. And I have those counts by district in the book. And Mott, who is not stupid, saw exactly what we were doing within the week, and he did the obvious thing, and it is the reason I dislike being right. If the game is now about what gets written and in what order it arrives, then a man with a printing press and 100 clerks can write faster than 20 tables in 20 lanes. They came in on a Monday. 91 papers, all in different hands, all dated the same day. All delivered by hand in one afternoon by people who had been paid a penny each to carry them. The hands were real, the names were real, every writer existed, and I checked 40 of them against the register that night, and every single one lived where the paper said and ate what the paper said. Every one of them said the same thing in almost the same words. The grain in the city store is rotting and they sell it to us anyway. I read the first one aloud at the counter under Rule 1, and then I read the second one, and then I stopped and put my hands flat on the wood and did not move for a while. Because it is true, there is rot in the city store. Everybody in Aldermere knows it, and it has been true for years, and the Crown sells the grain anyway. And every one of those 91 writers was telling the truth about their own bread. Not one of them names a place of payment. Not one of them can be held back, because the decree forbids it. Every one of them is dated the same day, so they all reach the 7th day together. 11 granaries. The whole winter store of a city of 90,000 people. 4 weeks before the first frost, and the crudest available reading of that sentence does not remove the rot from the grain. It removes the grain. All of it. The rotten part and the sound part together, because the sentence says the grain, and the box has never once in its life read a sentence the way a merciful man would. 91 true sentences, written by 91 real people, all dated the same Monday, and every single one of them said the grain. Not the rotten grain, not the part of it that is spoiled. The grain in the city store is rotting, and they sell it to us anyway. This is the wording. In 91 hands, and it is the wording that matters. I laid them out on the long desk in the second room, and Oda read them across while I read them down, and we found 4 different spellings and 1 identical sentence. 11 granaries stand behind the Fenner Gate. Between them they hold the winter store of Aldermere, which is about 90,000 people, and it was 4 weeks to first frost. The rot is real. It is in the 2 oldest granaries, in the bottom courses, and it has been there for years, and the Crown sells that grain at the same price as the sound grain because the Crown does not sort it. So the sentence is true, every part of it, and the crudest available reading of it does not clean the rot out of the store, because the sentence does not mention cleaning. It says the grain is rotting and they sell it anyway. The simplest way for that sentence to stop being true is for there to be no grain in the city store at all. 11 granaries emptied into nothing, or dismantled, or carted off as material by whatever the box decides suits it, 4 weeks before winter, in a city with no other store. That is not a fire, and it is not a war, and nobody dies that afternoon. What happens is that the bread price goes up in the second week of the frost, and by the end of the first month, people are eating seed grain, and by the second month, they are not eating. I have seen a famine year in this city. I was 6. I remember my mother counting bread in her hand, and I remember what my father's face did when the price board changed. So for that whole week I was not afraid of the box, and I was not afraid of the chancellor either. I was afraid of the second month of a winter in this city. The decree forbade me from holding one of them back. All petitions shall be read in the order in which they are received. 91 of them received on the same day at the same hour by paid carriers. And I could not find a lie anywhere in it, which is what makes the man extraordinary. 91 real people, real names, real bread, not one forgery. I checked 40 of them against the register myself. Hald Prim came to the counter on the Tuesday on his own, in a chancery coat that was newer than the one he had left in. He did not gloat. I would like that written down properly, because it would be easier for me if he had. He looked ill, and he stood at the counter like a man reporting to a superior he no longer has. He said I did not lie to anybody. He said I sat in 3 lanes for 4 days, and I told people how to write what was already true so that it could not be stopped by a clerk. I asked him one question. It was not a clever question, and I never needed a better one. I asked him what happens to the bread price in the second month of the frost. He did not answer. He stood there with his hand on the edge of my counter for about 10 seconds, and then he said that the chancery had told him the crown would buy in grain from Belhurst. I said with what, and from whose harvest, and carried on which road, and he did not have any of those numbers, because nobody had given them to him, because they do not exist. Then he put his hand off the counter, and left without saying anything else, and he walked instead of taking the coach that was waiting for him at the corner. Oda found the way through, and she found it in a place that only 2 people in this kingdom would have thought to look, which is the old chancery practice book from before the war. She put it on the desk open at a page about the duties of a receiving clerk, and she said, read the 3rd line, and then read it again. A petition answered is a petition in progress. 9 words in a practice book, under a heading about how a receiving clerk marks a docket so that 2 clerks do not act on the same paper. That is all it says, and it is not a rule about the box at all. It is 400-year-old housekeeping, written for a building full of clerks who kept doing each other's work twice. But the box has never cared where a rule comes from. It cares what is true. And if a petition has been answered in writing, then it is not an unanswered grievance sitting in a queue. It is a matter in progress. The box treats an answered petition as a thing already being done, and it does not fire on the 7th day, because the 7th day is for papers that nobody has done anything about at all. An answer is not a refusal, and this is where the clever part ends and the work begins. An answer has to be true, specific, delivered to the petitioner in person, and it has to say what will actually be done. So the work was 91 answers, written out in full, delivered by hand to the person who wrote the grievance in 6 days in a city of 90,000 people. We put it up on the board in the front room that night and split the city into 9 walks. 2 readers to a walk where the lanes were bad, 1 where they were not, and me on the 2 worst. We walked for 6 days. Let me be exact about what an answer is, because half the kingdom now thinks it was a magic phrase. You knock. You read the person their own sentence out loud, which most of them have never heard read back. Then you tell them what their words will actually do, in nouns, with the number of granaries in it. Then you offer them the 2 things they can do. Either amend the paper in their own hand, with 2 words, rotten and a place of payment, or accept a written answer from the service, signed, kept in the book, saying what will be done and by when. 58 of them amended their own papers, at their own tables, with their own pens, and no number in this account makes me prouder. Every one of those 58 had been lied to by a clerk with a printed form, and every one of them still sat down at their own table and fixed their own sentence in their own hand. A carter on Mill Street said he was not going to change 1 word for me. Then he asked what the amendment was, and I said, add the word rotten, and take the payment out of the collapsed east wall of the store. And he said, that is not a change. That is what I meant. That is what most of them said. That is what they had all meant. Nobody in that city wanted 11 granaries gone. They wanted the rot out and the price fair and somebody to admit it in writing. An old woman on Lamb Alley made me read her sentence 4 times and then amended it and then gave me a cup of small beer and told me I looked like a man who had been hit above the eye, which I had. One man would only amend his paper if I also took a complaint about his neighbor's rooster, so I sat in his kitchen and did the rooster properly, with the 3 questions and a named place of payment. It took 20 minutes, and it was the best rest I had all week. 33 of them we could not amend. 11 had moved. 6 were at sea. 4 refused outright, and they had every right to. and one of them told me to my face that he wanted the store gone and the crown to feel it. And 12 of them were people the chancery had paid a penny to carry and a clerk to help with the words. And every one of those 12 was frightened of losing something if they changed a syllable. So those 33 got the second thing. And the second thing is the one that put the office of a god into play 8 months later, although I did not know it then. I wrote them answers, not refusals, answers, on the form the receiving clerks used 400 years ago, one per petitioner, signed by me and countersigned by 2 readers. Each one said the same 3 things in different words. Your grievance is received and it is true. So this is what will be done about it. Here is by when, and here is the name of the person who will answer to you if it is not. And here is the part that cost me a night of my life. An answer has to be true. So I could not write that the rot would be cleared unless the rot was actually going to be cleared by somebody with hands, by a date. I did not have that authority. I am a junior scribe with a burned hand. So I went to the Crown Advocate at 9 at night in her own house, and I asked her for it, and I brought the payment book. She read the whole situation in about 4 minutes. Then she said the Crown will not thank you. And I said the Crown will not have a store either, and she went and put her coat on. By 2 in the small hours, I had a warrant from the office of the Crown Advocate, countersigned by the granary master, to sort and destroy the spoiled stock by inventory, at the Crown's cost, beginning on the 8th day. So the answer that went out to those 33 people was true when it was written, which is the only reason any of it worked. The Crown will clear the rot by inventory, beginning on the 8th day, and Emmerich Vane will answer for it. I walked the last 11 answers myself on the 6th day, and somewhere on Lamb Alley, my legs stopped working properly, and I sat down on a step and could not get up for a while. I had eaten twice in 4 days and slept about 6 hours, and there was a nosebleed that would not stop, and I sat on that step and bled onto a bundle of answers. Tam Wick found me there. He took the bundle out of my hands and he said, "Sit down, you are bleeding on the docket," and then he walked the last 4 himself and did them better than I would have. That belongs on the record instead of the version where I do it all. 9 people carried the last day. It is every part of the difference between a man with a box and a service. On the 6th evening, with the light going and the last bundle still not walked, Hald Prim came back to the reading room, and nobody had asked him to. He stood in the doorway of the front room with the rein on his shoulders and asked whether there was anything he could carry. Nobody answered him for about 5 seconds. Then Bettany Crow put a stack of 9 answers in his arms and told him the addresses, and he went out into the rain and delivered them and came back and did not stay. He never asked to be reinstated, and I never offered. He carried 9 answers on the 6th night, and that is in the book too, with his name, because it is a cost that was paid and I record those. The 7th day was the 6th of the month. Sunrise about 6:30, and every fuse in that 100 timed off the hour the paper was written, which is midday. We had until noon. 58 amended, 33 answered, and under the decree, we still had to read all 91 in the order received, so we read from 4 in the morning. 9 readers, 4 desks, out loud, one after another, with the amended texts and the answers stapled together and the fuse hour chalked at the top of each one. I have never heard anything like the sound of that room. 9 voices reading Grain and Rotten and East Wall and by inventory over and over in a building with the shutters open because there were people in the street outside listening. The crowd came at about 8. Mott had sent them, or rather, he had told the districts on the Friday that the keeper of the box intended to empty the granaries, and about 400 people had come to the Fenner Gate to stop me. By 9, they were listening at the shutters. By 10, a man in the front said loudly, "So he is reading them out, is he?" And somebody who had been there since 8 said yes, all morning, with the amendments. At about 11, a carter from Mill Street pushed through to the front of the crowd and put his hand flat on the shutter and said, "Give me one. I can read." I gave him one. He read it out on the step of the reading room to about 400 people in the street, and he read it badly, and with enormous feeling, and I had to ask him to stop performing and just say the words. 11 laymen read that morning. It is not lawful, and it was never repeated, and I would do it again. The last 9 papers went out of that box in the mouths of people who had come to shout at me. At 20 minutes to noon, we were 9 papers short of the 91, and the gray cat was asleep on the pile with his chin on the string. He had been on it since dawn. Bettany went to move him, and I said leave the cat, because there was an amended paper under him that I could see the corner of, and moving a cat off a bundle takes about 4 seconds that we did not have. Those 4 seconds are in the book. I entered them as a credit to the cat, in the same column as the tanner's 2 days of labor, and Bettany Crow has never once let me forget it. We read the last paper at 4 minutes to noon, and it was one of the amended ones, and it named the collapsed east wall of the old store as the place of payment. Then the granaries went, and they went as I had written them, and this is the part that people do not believe until they have seen a granted amendment work. The rot came out, not the grain. The bottom courses of 2 granaries, about 900 sacks of spoiled stock, lifted out and stacked in the yard and burned by the granary master under warrant, sorted by inventory, exactly as the answer said it would be. The collapsed east wall went, stone by stone, into the repair of the 2 sound walls that the spoiled stock had rotted through. 9 granaries stood untouched. 2 were emptied of rot and left standing. 9 granaries of 11, full, sound, and sorted, with the rot burned in the yard under a warrant signed by the Crown Advocate. A city ate that winter. And then the payment for the 33 came due, because an answered petition is a petition in progress, and a petition in progress still costs what it costs. 33 answers, each one promising work by the 8th day, and the box takes material for work in progress the same way it takes material for anything else. The collapsed east wall was already spent. It had gone into the granary repairs at 4 minutes to noon, so the box went to the next nearest suitable material, and that is what it always does, and I knew that, and I had not been able to find a way round it. Tannery Row runs 1 street behind the Fenner Gate, and it is 40 houses of lath and lime and thatch. 3 blocks of it came down between noon and about 1:15, not burning. Dismantled, into the road, in courses, and the stone of it went into the granary walls and the new floors. And by the middle of the afternoon, there were 3 streets of people standing in the road, looking at where their houses had been. Nobody was under them, not one person. Every soul on that row was at the Fenner Gate watching the reading, because Mott had told them to come and shout at me, and that is the only reason I am not writing a very different account. I have gone over that for years. The man who sent a crowd to stop me is the reason nobody died when the crowd's houses came down. Then the fire, which was ours and not the boxes. The spoiled stock was burning in the granary yard under warrant in a 900 sack heap, and the wind came round to the north at about 1 o'clock. Burning grain does not throw flame. It throws smoke and husk, and the husk went up over the wall and came down on the roofs behind the yard, and the roofs behind the yard are the thatch end of Tannery Row. 4 houses took fire. We had 200 people in the street already, and a fire chain formed faster than the parish could have organized one, and the whole thing was out in half an hour. I carried paper. That is what I did in a fire. The queue was in the front room of a building with the shutters open and burning husk coming down on the street outside. And I carried 600 fuses out of it in armfuls with a reader either side of me. Leave the crates, the dockets. Only the dockets, somebody shouted, and my palms opened up over the old burn from the first night and bled into the bundles. And there are papers in the archive with my blood on the corners. 2 readers were coughing black for a week. Dow, the carter who took a beam on his back in the old registry, went into the thatch end twice and pulled out a woman and then a mattress, and I have never decided whether the mattress was foolish. And then Tobin Quill, who was 9 years old and who had been standing at the end of the street with his sister, went back into the reading room for the payment book. I did not send him. Nobody sent him. He was 9 years old and he was standing in the street with his sister, and the shutters were open and the smoke was coming through in the way smoke does when a room is drawing it. He went in low, the way they teach children in that quarter, and he came out with the book against his chest and dropped it on the cobbles in front of me and then bent over with his hands on his knees. I got down on the cobbles in front of him and asked him what he thought he was doing, and he said it while he was still coughing. You said every line matters. Nessa took him by the collar and told him he was an idiot, and then held on to him for about a minute longer than the telling off needed. He coughed for about 2 days after that, and then he seemed better. And I noted in the book that the boy had breathed smoke, because I note everything, and then I did not think about it again for 11 days. At sunset, the crowd was still there, and they were not shouting, and somebody had brought a table out of the alehouse and put it in the middle of Fenner Street. Bettany Crow stood on it and read the payment book out loud to about 600 people. Every line of that day, the rot burned by inventory, the east wall spent, 3 blocks of Tannery Row taken and owed. Then the numbers, 9 granaries of 11, sound, sorted, 406 papers read that week. 91 answered or amended by their own writers, none burned unread. Then she read the last line, which I had written on the cobbles with the book on my knee an hour earlier, and which she made me stand up for. 3 blocks of tannery row, taken in payment, owed to the households named on the schedule, and the schedule to be posted at the counter within 2 days. Oral Mott was at the far end of Fenner Street with 2 clerks. He had been there since about 4. I saw him watching the table, and the crowd around it, and the woman on it reading out my mistakes. He said one word to the clerk beside him, and the clerk told somebody afterward that the word was enough. And then the Lord Chancellor of Verland walked out of that street first, while 600 people stayed to hear the end of the accounts. The granary master came at dawn with his count. 9 full, 2 emptied of rot and standing, and he said we eat until spring. 309 people were in barracks by then, and that is what we call the old wool sheds when the parish puts families in them, sharing 1 pump and 1 cistern between all of them. That is a number I wrote down carefully and did not think hard enough about, and everything that happens after this is in that sentence. Somebody in the crowd asked whether the barracks could be complained about, and I said yes. Write it, carefully, with a place of payment, and come to me first. And at about 8 that morning, while I was still on the step with the count in my hand, 3 women came up Fenner Street together and put a paper on my counter. They had written it themselves, all 3 of them, in one hand with 2 other names under it, and it was 4 lines, and it was signed and dated. The physician's water is killing our children. 4 lines under it, 3 names at the bottom, and the date in the corner in a careful hand. I read it alone, at 3 in the morning, in a room with 8 empty desks in it, and there is no version of this where that was not a choice. The service was asleep. 9 people had walked a city for 6 days, and stood in a fire and carried 600 papers out of a burning street, and I had sent them home myself at 9 that evening. So, there was nobody to ask. I have said that sentence to myself about 4,000 times since, and it is true, and it is not an excuse, because I could have waited until morning. The paper had 5 days on its fuse. 5, not 1. I want that on the record in the plainest words I have. I was not out of time. I was out of patience with waiting for other people. Rule 1 is read the sentence out loud before the box hears it, and I did that. My Rule 1 has never saved anybody by itself. It is Rule 2 that saves people. Rule 2 is the one Bettany Crow wrote, about asking who else depends on the man whose life you are about to take apart. It is on the wall in every reading room in this kingdom because of what I did in the next 4 minutes. I said it out loud to myself, in an empty room, at 3 in the morning. Who else eats from him? And I answered my own question, which is not the same as asking it. I said, he is a physician, so his patients eat from him, and the crown has 4 more physicians in this city, and the parish will send another one within the month. That is a plausible answer. It is the answer any sensible man would give. It is also an answer I made up sitting at a desk out of my own head, without opening 1 volume of the register. 11 years in that register, and I did not go up the stairs and look. I had checked a stable girl's scales, and a farmer's toll, and a tannery sluice, and I did not check a physician. The paper said the physician's water is killing our children. Under it, 4 lines and 3 names. It named Wilm Kobe of Chandler Street, and it said his cordial had been given to 5 children, and that 3 of them were sick and 1 was very sick. I did check that part, and I will be fair to myself where I can be. I sent to the parish clerk at midnight and had the sickness confirmed and the names verified. And it was all true. Kobe had made up a fever cordial with water out of the wrong barrel, not the cistern he keeps clean, the rain butt at the back of his yard, in a week where he had 30 patients and no time and 1 pair of hands. The rain butt stands under a gutter that runs off a roof where pigeons sit. And that was the whole mechanism. No poisoner, no plot, no negligence worth hanging a man for. A tired physician and the wrong barrel on the wrong night. That was his whole crime, and I knew it exactly. And it is real, and 3 children were sick because of it. The mothers were right. There is nothing wrong with that paper, except what happened next. I read it out at 4 minutes past 3, in an empty room, in the flat voice I use for everything, and there was nobody there to stop me at any point in that sentence. The box grants the letter. The letter said the physician's water is killing our children, and the simplest true way to stop a physician's water from reaching children is to stop him being a physician. His license was revoked between 1 heartbeat and the next, in a drawer in the parish office, with the ink of the entry changing on the page, and with the license went the keys. That is a thing I had never thought about once, in 11 years of writing licenses for other men, and I want anybody who ever does my job to hear it. A license in this kingdom is not paper. It is a right of access. The keys of a licensed physician open the parish medicine store. the pest house, the well house of his ward, and every lock that the parish has given him charge of. At about 9 the next morning, Wilm Kobe stood in the doorway of the reading room with his coat buttoned wrong and asked me one question that I could never get out of my head. He was 51, and he had been up all night with a sick child that was not one of the three. He said, "You took my keys." Then he said, "Do you know what else those keys open?" I did not. I stood at my own counter and did not know, and I asked him and he told me, and I wrote it down while he was telling me, because my hands do that when the rest of me has stopped. There is a covered catchment behind the old chapel at the top of Chandler Street. Stone cistern, sand and gravel bed. Timber lid, built for the chapel 200 years ago and forgotten by the parish when the chapel closed. It is the only clean standing water within a quarter-mile of Tannery Row, and it has been maintained for 12 years by one man, unpaid, unrecorded, and unknown to anybody except the people who fill their buckets from it. Wilm Kobe cleaned that catchment. Twice a year he drained it and turned the gravel and relaid the sand, and every week he walked up and lifted the lid and looked, and that is why the water in it was good. Nobody paid him. Nobody knew. It is not in the word volume, because a man who quietly maintains a thing does not appear in a register, which is the exact blind spot of my entire trade. And with his license revoked, the parish keys were void, and the lid of that cistern is locked, and the lock is the parish's, and by law nobody could open it without a licensed hand. 309 people were in the woolshed barracks behind Fenner Gate. Their houses were the 3 blocks of Tannery Row that had gone in payment 11 days earlier. They had 1 pump and 1 cistern between them, and the cistern was the one on Chandler Street, and I had locked it at 4 minutes past 3 in the morning with a sentence. I have done a great many stupid things. I have never done anything as stupid as that, and it was not one moment of stupidity. It was 4 days of work that could not go fast enough. I got a warrant application to the parish that same morning. A new license takes 9 days. There is no shorter form. I read every clause of that procedure twice looking for a door, and there is no door. The Crown Advocate was out of the city. The parish clerk would not act without her, and he was right not to, because the last time a parish clerk in this city opened a locked store on his own initiative, he was hanged for it in my grandfather's time. I went to the chancery. I stood in an anteroom for 2 hours and was told politely that the Lord Chancellor was in council, and I have never known whether that was true. I could not file for myself. My own paper comes out blank, and the wronged party here was 300 people who did not yet know that anything had been taken from them. So I fell back on the one thing that was left to me, which is the least clerical thing I have ever done in my life, and I did it for 4 days, and it did not work. I carried water from the pump at the Fenner Gate, which is sound and very slow, up to the wool sheds, in 2 leather buckets, on foot, about 400 paces each way. 2 buckets is a house for a day if they are careful. 309 people. Perrin Lowe carried, and Dow carried with a bad back, and Bettany Crow carried, and Tam carried, and about 20 people from the row carried. We moved perhaps a fifth of what that many people need, and we did it for 4 days, and the pump at the Fenner Gate runs slow, and by the second day the queue at it was 2 hours long. I did the arithmetic on the second night the way I do everything, and it came out at about 900 gallons a day needed, and about 180 carried. You cannot carry a cistern in leather buckets. You can only look as if you are trying. My hands opened up again on the second day, over the old burn, and the rope handles took the skin off both palms, and Oda bound them and I carried with the bindings on. A woman called Sarah Fenn kept a tally on the shed wall in chalk of how many buckets came in each day, because she said if it is not counted, then nobody has to answer for it, and she had learned that from the counter at Fenner Street. Her tally is the only record of those 4 days that was not made by me, and I have a copy of it, and it is the most damning document in my possession. A woman in the barracks said what ended my pride for good. She looked at the 2 buckets I had just put down, and she said 2 buckets a house. That is not water. That is a promise. By the 4th day, people were drinking out of the shed cistern, which is a stone tank under the yard that the wool trade used for washing, and which had 300 people living around it. Do not make this a mystery. There was no plague and no curse and nothing anybody could not have predicted. 300 people, 1 bad cistern, 4 days, in a wet autumn, and children drink first, because that is what mothers do. Tobin Quill got sick on the 4th night. He was dead when the 7th day comes, in the wool shed, on a straw mattress, with his sister holding a cup he could not drink from. I am not going to write that part at any length. He was 9. He had breathed smoke in a reading room 11 days earlier carrying a ledger out for me, and his chest had been wrong ever since, and I had noted it, and done nothing. The smoke did not kill him, and I am putting that down exactly because I have heard the story told the other way, and the other way lets me off. The smoke weakened his chest. The water killed him. It was the water in the shed cistern, which 300 people were using because a clean catchment 2 lanes away was locked. Because I had revoked a man's keys at 3 in the small hours without asking who else ate from him. 4 deaths in those sheds that fortnight. 2 old men and a woman of 30 and a boy of 9. The parish put all 4 down as autumn fever. And the parish was wrong. And I have the 4 names on 1 page in my own hand. Nessa said it to me in the doorway of the shed, with her brother behind her under a blanket, and she did not shout it, and she has never once shouted at me in her life. She said it quietly, and she said it once, and I have never needed it repeated. He was getting better. It was the water. You know it was the water. I said yes. There was nothing else true available to say to her, and she would have known at once if I had reached for anything softer than that. Then she went back inside, and she did not speak to me again for 4 months, and the last thing she said before she stopped was that she wanted his name written in the book. She did not mean the parish book. She meant mine, the one on the counter, in the column where the payments go, and she said it as an instruction and not as a request. I wrote it that night. Tobin Quill, aged 9, of Tannery Row, taken in payment for the reading of the complaint against Wilm Kobe, read alone by the keeper at the dead middle of the night, contrary to Rule 2. This is the only line in that book with a person's name in the column where the materials go. I have not managed to decide whether writing it there was the most honest thing I have ever done or an obscenity. Wilm Kobe got his license back on the 9th day, by the ordinary procedure, and opened the catchment himself, and the water went clean for the barracks on the 10th. He came and stood at my counter afterward, and he did not accuse me of anything, and I would rather he had. He said the mothers were right about my cordial. Then he said, and I was the only man keeping that cistern. Both of those things are true at once. That is all the trouble with the box, and the whole trouble with justice, and I had spent 9 months learning it, and had still not learned it. I offered him the keeping of the catchment on the parish record, with a fee out of my own posting, and he refused the fee and took the record. It is the first entry in the ward volume, for a thing a man was already doing for nothing. And then Aurel Mott, Lord Chancellor of Verlund, the man who had flooded my counter with 91 weaponized petitions, paid for the funeral. He did it quietly, and he did it fast. He sent a man to the sexton, and he paid the ground fee and the box and the bearers for a boy from Tannery Row, and he did not put his name on anything. I found out because I read the sexton's book, because I read everything, and there it was in the second column in a chancery hand. Then he came to Tannery Row himself in a plain coat with no clerks, and stood at the back of the burial with his hat in his hand, and he spoke to the mothers who had written the paper, and he was kind to them. I watched a man who had flooded my counter with 91 weaponized petitions be quietly and completely decent to 3 women in a graveyard, and I could not lay one document against it. It is the thing about him that I still cannot explain to anybody who did not meet him. He is not a hypocrite. He believes that a kingdom is a machine and that machines eat people, and he is kind to the people in front of him while he oils it. He said one thing to me, and only one. He said 9 days for a warrant. I wrote that rule myself 30 years ago, and I'm not proud of it today. I have never worked out whether that was a move. That is what he does to people. He makes it impossible to tell. And after a while, you notice that you have been thinking about him for an hour instead of about the person you buried. Oda Brill said the thing nobody else in that service was old enough or guilty enough to say to me, and she said it 3 days after the burial, in the 4th room, with the door shut. She waited until the counter was shut and the others had gone, and then she said 4 words to me and made them land. She said, "You read alone." I said, "I know." She said, 40 years ago, one man decided on his own what was clutter and had it carried into a cellar. You know his name." I said, "That is not the same." She said, "No, it is not the same. It is the same shape, and the shape is a man deciding on his own that he is the one who understands." I did not answer that. I went and got a brush and a pot of whitewash, and I painted Rule 2 on the wall of the front room in letters a foot high over the counter, where I have to look at it every day I work. Ask who else eats from the man you are about to break. 9 words in whitewash, a foot high over the counter, where I have to look at them on every working day of my life. It was already Rule 2. It had been Rule 2 for 2 months. Painting it was not humility. It was a man doing something with his hands, and Oda watched me do it and did not say a word. The service kept working through all of it, and I did not expect that, and it is the single reason any part of this account ends well instead of badly. They read 41 papers that week without me. Tam ran the counter, Bettany Crow took the clinics, Oda kept the queue and chalked the fuse dates herself. They also held 2 papers the proper way. by walking to the writers and explaining that the wording would take a neighbor's roof. One came in and amended it. The other did not, and it fired on the 7th day and took a shed door. Tam came and reported to me on the Sunday, as if I were still the keeper, and read out the count, and then said gently, "We read 41 this week, by the rules, without you." He did not mean it as a knife. He meant it kindly, as a report to a man who was not well, and it was both a comfort and a knife, and both of those were correct. 212 people were in training in 20 towns by then, on the wording sheets, taught by the 9, and I had built that on purpose so that it would not need me, and then it did not need me, and I found out what that feels like. Osk had 11 of them at Taro Ford, working off the same 3 questions off a trestle table. Bellhurst had a room. 6 towns on the river had a table in the church porch 2 evenings a week, with a fishwife's rule painted over it. The summons came at the end of that week, and it was thicker than the last one because there was a witness list attached to it. The crown against the man who keeps the box, on the matter of the death of a child and of the conduct of the reading service, before the king's bench, on the 10th day. Orel Mott had brought it. Not Tarn, not a magistrate, not a clerk. The Lord Chancellor himself was named as the party bringing the action, which he had never done in 30 years of office. And the first name on the witness list for the crown was Nessa Quill of Tannery Row, 12 years, sister of the deceased. I read that line standing in the front room under a foot-high whitewashed rule that I had painted 3 days earlier, and I did not go to her house. I have been asked why not. The honest answer is that I had no right to walk up to a girl who had buried her brother and ask her what she was going to say about me in a court. The other honest answer is that I was afraid of what she would say, and both of those were in me at the same time, and only one of them was creditable. I spent the 8 days before that court doing nothing that would help me in it. I posted the schedule for the 3 blocks of Tannery Row at the counter, and got 2/3 of it repaid in materials out of the granary works. So, on the 9th evening, I did the thing I should have done at 3 o'clock in the dark 11 days before. And I did it in front of all 9 of them, in the front room, with the door open. I said I am asking all of you, before I read anything, before I go into that court, before I say one word on my own behalf, what do we do? Nobody spoke for a moment, because in 9 months I had never once opened a question like that in that room, and every one of them noticed. Then Bethany Crow put her hands flat on the desk and asked the question that decided the case, and she asked it as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She said it in the tone she uses at the fish counter when somebody has asked a stupid question about the price. She said, "Who is entitled to complain about you?" The crown against the keeper of the complaint box, on the 10th day of the month, in the same hall with the black and white floor. And this time, nobody had put the box on a cushion. They had it on the floor by the clerk's table with a rope round it, like a dog that has bitten somebody. And there were about 300 people in the public benches, which is more than that hall was built for. Orel Mott opened himself, not an advocate. Him, standing in dark gray, with a folder that had one exhibit in it and no notes. He did not mention Tobin Quill by name for the first quarter of an hour, and that was deliberate and correct, because the moment you use a dead child as an argument, you look like a man using a dead child. He said the keeper is an honest man. He said it twice. Then he said, and that is the difficulty, because an honest man with a private rule is worse than a corrupt one with a public rule. Then he opened the folder and put my own rule sheet on the table in front of the bench. The one from the cold room, in my hand, with 8 names on it and 1 blank line. Exhibit 1, he said, in the hand of the keeper. And he read Rule 2 out loud himself. Ask who else eats from the man you are about to break. He read it well. Then he said, "This is a good rule. It is a better rule than anything in my chancery. And the man who wrote it broke it 11 days ago at 3 in the morning. And a child is buried." That was the case against me. It is not a lie, and it does not distort anything. Every word of it is true, and it was assembled entirely out of my own work, which is what he does. Then he said the part that was actually aimed at the future rather than at me. He said no man should hold this. Not me, not him. It should be held by an office of the crown, with a register and an appeal. And a good half of that room agreed with him, and so did about 4 people in my own service. And I set that down plainly, because it is the reason the day mattered. I did not answer any of it. The advocate had told me to sit still, and I sat still, and my throat would not have worked anyway with 300 people in the room. When the bench asked whether the keeper wished to be heard, I stood up and said that before I answered anything, I wished to hear a complaint, and there was a noise in the public benches. Then I asked leave for the district of Tannery Row to be heard first, because I had asked them 9 days earlier, in front of my whole service, to write one. What the 9 of us had done on the 9th evening was this. In the front room, after Bettany Crow put her hands on the desk and asked who is entitled to complain about you. I cannot file for myself. My paper comes out blank and it always has. But a complaint against me by somebody I have wronged works exactly like any other paper in that crate. So we walked Tannery Row and the wool sheds, all 9 of us, and we told 309 people that if the keeper of the box had wronged them, they could write it, and that I would read it myself, in court, out loud, whatever it said. We did not draft it. Let me state that flatly. Because the Chancery said afterward that I had written my own indictment in order to control it. I never saw one word of it before it was handed up to the bench. Oda argued against the entire idea for an hour. She said a service that invites its own destruction is not brave, it is tired, and she was talking about me and everybody in the room knew it. What changed her was Tam, who said that if the district could not complain about us, then we were exactly the seal we had spent 9 months taking apart. Bettany Crow read the 3 questions to them at the shed door, and then walked away and left them to it, and they had 8 days. What came back was 1 paper in 3 hands. Sarah Fenn wrote the first part, a man called Kor wrote the middle, and Nessa Quill wrote the last 2 lines. The usher handed it up. The bench asked whether the keeper was aware of its contents, and I said no. And Mott asked the same question a different way, and I said no again. Then I read it out loud in the King's Bench, which is the only time in my life my voice has held in a full hall. And I have thought about why ever since, and I have no explanation for it. It said that the keeper had taken 3 blocks of Tannery Row in payment, which had been chosen by nobody in those blocks, and that the schedule was posted but not paid. It said that he had read a paper alone at night, when he had promised not to, and that a clean cistern was locked for 9 days because of it. It said that 4 people in the sheds died in that fortnight, and it named all 4 of them, and the last name on the list was a boy of 9. Then Nessa's 2 lines. He should not be the only one who reads, and take his desk for it, so that everybody can see what it cost him. That last line is not law. It is a place of payment, named by a petitioner, in her own hand, at 12 years old, and the box does not care that it was written by a child. There was no argument to make against it. It was true. I stood there with it in my hands, in front of 300 people, and I said out loud that every line of it was true, and that I did not contest one word. Mott could have objected. A complaint against the defendant, read by the defendant in the middle of the Crown's own case, is not a procedure that exists anywhere in the law of this kingdom. He did not object, and I have turned that over for a year. I think he wanted the court to watch a man be judged by the people he serves, because he believed it would prove his argument for him. Then I read it a second time, deliberately, as a reading, with the box 9 feet away on the floor with a rope round it. The desk went first. My desk, out of the 4th room at Fenner Street, 2 miles away, and I heard about it afterward. It came apart in courses and went into the roof of the wool sheds where the barracks are. Then the sole custody went, and that is the part nobody had predicted, including me. Whatever it is in that box that decides such things, took her sentence at its word. He should not be the only one who reads. So the right of sole reading came off me in that hall, in front of the Crown, and it did not go to the Chancery, and it did not go to the King. It went to everybody on the roll. 9 names on a rule sheet in a cold room, and 212 in training in 20 towns. And from that hour, any one of them could open that box, and I could not stop them. The Chancellor got what he had asked for in his opening, and he got it from a 12-year-old girl from Tannery Row, and he got it 11 minutes before he lost everything else. What he did next is worth describing because it was the only time I ever saw him move fast. He put both hands on the table and said the Crown accepts the transfer of custody and moves that the box be delivered to the Chancery this morning. And I said, in my flat clerk's voice, that before the Chancery takes anything, the court might wish to hear one archive receipt 40 years old. Mott said the origin of the object is not before this court. The advocate said it is now, since custody is being transferred, and I have rarely seen a woman enjoy a sentence more. Then I asked that it be entered by inventory, with witnesses, and read by another hand, and I quoted the Chancery's own standing rule on the reading of archive material, which is in his own regulations, drafted under his own name. He could not object to his own regulation in front of the bench, with his own name printed under it in the volume the usher was holding. He sat down without a word. Tam Wicks stood up. Baker's son, 18 by then, in a coat that had been mended at the elbow by his mother in a house with a rebuilt west wall. He read it the way he reads everything, slowly, with his mouth moving, stopping twice, and the entire King's Bench and 300 people in the public benches waited for him without one sound. 1 petition box. From the West Hall to the transfer cellar, by order. Then the date, 40 years back, in the margin. Then the signature at the bottom, A. Mott, Under Secretary. He got to the name and stopped because he had not read ahead, because I had asked him not to, so that the room would watch him find it. Then he said it again, because the bench asked him to, and this time he got the pronunciation of chancery wrong, and Arl Mott corrected him from his seat, by reflex, out loud, in front of everybody. And that was the single worst thing that ever happened to that man in public, and nobody did it to him. He did it to himself, with 2 words out of 40 years of habit. The hall understood it in stages. First the date, then the age of the box, which every person in that room had assumed to be a relic of the old kings. Then the fact that the man who had buried it was sitting in the front row in dark gray, having just told the court that no man should hold such a thing. The king was there. I have not said that yet because I did not look at him for the first 2 hours. Severin II, sitting to the left of the bench with the screen half in front of him, the way the crown sits when it is present and not judging. He put the screen back himself and asked the chancellor, without any preamble, whether he had put the box into the cellar. Mott did not lie about it, and I will give him that until the day I die. He stood up in his own defense and said yes, he had done it. He said he had been 23 years old, and had understood at once what a free working grievance does to a kingdom that farms its revenues, and that he had done it deliberately and would do it again. Then, he put it in the way that made him worth fighting. He said, "And if this court restores it to the districts without an office to govern it, you will have justice that no man can afford, and it will eat the poor first. And I have shown you that it already has." He is not wrong. 3 warehouses, 26 households, 3 blocks of Tannery Row, and 4 graves say he is not wrong, and I have every one of them in my book in my own handwriting. And the answer to that argument is not a cellar. It took me 9 months and a boy's funeral to be able to say it in 1 sentence. And here it is. I said it to the bench quietly, and the advocate repeated it for the room. The cost is not the box. The cost is that nobody writes down who pays. We wrote it down. Here it is. Then I put the payment book on the table. Not the fair copy. The working one, with the burned corner and the blood on the edge from the night of the fire, open at the first page. 7 paving stones. Yard of Halbert Pruitt, Tannery Row, page 1 of 1, dated in my own hand at about 3 in the morning on the first night I ever read anything. The bench read that book for about half an hour while nobody said anything. 300 people sat in silence and watched 3 judges turn pages. Then the Crown Advocate rose and said that the farm of tolls stood upon the same principle as the box, which is that somebody pays and nobody writes it down, and she asked the Crown to open the toll accounts to the same test. The king ended the farm of tolls that morning from his chair in 9 words, since it was his to end and no judgment was needed. The clerk wrote it down, and the chancellor bowed. 40 years of revenue farming in this kingdom ended on a Tuesday morning because a 19-year-old clerk had started a receipt book about a well and had never once been willing to leave a line out of it. And it was ended on a condition that I did not ask for, and that has cost the chancery more than the money did. Every crown taking from that day is entered in a payment book of the same form, and the book is open at a counter. Arl Mott bowed and said the crowns will be done, and then he asked, and this is the measure of the man, whether he might be permitted to inspect the form of the book so that the chancery's version was correct. He was not destroyed. He lost the farm and the office of chancellor within the month, and he was not imprisoned, and I never asked for it. He was made to answer to a ledger, which for him is worse, and which he understood perfectly. The first entry against his name in that new crown book is the upkeep of the crossing at Taro Ford, 9 years unpaid, charged at the lawful rate, when Ardle's grandson could read it at a counter today if he wanted to. Then the court came back to the question of what I actually am, since the sole right of reading had gone to the roll and the chancery had not got the box either. The advocate said there is no office for this. The bench said there is now. The king asked what the man had been called by the people who use him, and about 9 people in the public benches said it at once. They said it the way a crowd says a thing it has been saying to itself for months without noticing. The reader, not the keeper, the reader. He said it back, to me, in a hall where I had been kicked down a set of steps 10 months earlier for holding a crate. He said the reader, Emmerich Vane. I tried to say thank you, and it came out as air, with nothing behind it, as it always does. And the king waited 15 seconds in front of 300 people while a clerk got his throat to work. I said thank you. That is all I got out, and it was enough. And Tamwick told me afterward that half the public benches were crying, and I did not see any of it. The charter was drafted that same afternoon in the room behind the bench, and I was allowed to sit at the table for it, which I had not expected. 212 readers confirmed in 20 towns, each one bound by the rule sheet, signed personally, and struck off the roll by their own service and not by the crown if they break it. That clause took an hour to draft, and it is the one I fought for hardest. A reader who answers to the crown is a chancery clerk with a different hat, and the whole trade dies the day that becomes true. The king asked me who would judge a reader who broke the rules. I said the 8 names on the sheet and the people whose houses were taken, and he asked whether that was enough, and I said it is the only thing that has ever worked so far. The costs of granted complaints charged upon a declared fund of the treasury, so that the material comes from the crown's account and not from whichever neighbor happens to be nearest, wherever the fund can reach. That last clause is the one I had wanted since a man in his shirt asked me where his yard had gone, and it took 10 months and everything I owned. The clerk asked me to check the draft for errors, which I did, and I found one. The word petitioner was spelled 2 ways on the same page, and I said so, and the clerk laughed and then saw that I was serious. I also asked for a second copy for the reading room counter and was told the crown makes no copies of a charter, so I sat in that room for 2 hours after everybody had gone and made one myself in my own hand. Nessa Quill was in the gallery through all of it. She had come as a witness for the crown, and she had not been called because the case had stopped being a case at about the 2nd hour. I found her on the stair afterward. She was 12, in her good dress, with her hands behind her back, and she looked at me for a while before she said anything. She said I did not come for them, and she said it with no weight on it at all. Then she said the rest. I came to see whether you would read one about yourself. I said I did. She said I know. I watched you do it. Then she said the last part, which I could never write down without stopping. She said that was for him, and it is done now, and I am going home. I did not ask what was in her pocket. She had her hand on something in her apron all of time she was talking to me, and I saw it, and I did not ask. Out of what I told myself was respect. That is the last mistake in this account, and it is not a small one. I have told myself for a year that it was respect. Respect is not the same thing as not wanting to know. She went down the stair and out of the hall, and she did not go home. She went to Fenner Street, where a box now stood without a rope round it, in a reading room with a foot-high rule painted over the counter. I went back to the reading room myself an hour behind her, and the counter was busy, and nobody in that room said one word to me about a charter or a king. It was the first evening in 10 months that anybody in this kingdom could put a paper into that box without it being handed to me, and she is the person who used it. Bethany Crow was on the counter that evening and said afterward that the Quill girl came in about 8, said good evening, put a paper through the slot herself, and left. She did not write it that night. She had written it 4 months earlier, in the week her brother was buried, on the good paper the parish gives out for burial letters, and she had carried it in her apron every day since. It was 4 lines, signed with her whole name, and dated in the corner as I taught 6 villages to date everything. The date on it was the day of the funeral. The warden saw and did not answer. And that is not just. This is the first line, and it is the line that everybody in this kingdom now knows by heart. Under it, 2 more lines, naming what was seen and when, in a child's careful hand, with a place and an hour, because she had been taught to write a grievance by the best table in this kingdom, and she had done it properly. Tatter got up on the crate at about 9 and went to sleep on top of it, which he has done 1,000 times and which has never once mattered. It did not matter that night either. It bought nothing. The fuse was already running, and it had 7 days on it, and the paper underneath the cat was a complaint against the God of just judgment. 4 lines in a child's careful hand on burial paper, dated the day of her brother's funeral, and a fuse of 7 days that had started running at about 8 in the evening when she put it through the slot. It said this: the warden saw and did not answer, and that is not just. 9 words on the first line, and 3 more lines under them, and a signature. Oda read it first, at the counter, at 9 that night, and then she came and stood in the doorway of the 3rd room where I sleep, and waited until I woke up. She put it in my hands, and I read it twice before I said anything, and then I said the only sensible thing, which is that a grievance must be against a person, and the warden is not a person. She said the warden is the God of just judgment. He is in the statute book. He is in every oath in this kingdom. 200 years of chancery practice treats him as a party who can be sworn by. Then she said the sentence that ended the argument in about 4 seconds. She said it is true in substance. That is all the box has ever needed. The second and third lines are why. She had written what was seen and when, in the way I taught 6 villages to write everything. On this day, at this hour, in the wool sheds, a boy of 9 died of bad water, and the warden of just judgment saw it and answered nothing. That is not blasphemy, and it is not a curse. It is a statement of fact, in the form of a grievance, with a date and a place and a witness, and every part of it is true. The fourth line is the one that made it a petition rather than a cry. She wrote that she was the wronged party because the boy was her brother and she is what is left of him. I have read a great many papers. That is the best written grievance I have ever held in my hands, and it was written by a 12-year-old, and I taught her. And I have never decided how to feel about that. I did the obvious things first, in order, one after another, as a tired man does when he does not want to look straight at the problem in front of him. I checked whether a paper can be withdrawn by its author. It can. It is in the practice book, and it is the oldest right a petitioner has, and it takes 1 line and a signature. So I could have walked to Tannery Row that night and asked a grieving girl to unwrite the truth about her brother in order to make my week easier. I sat with that for about an hour, and then I put it out of my head and never took it out again. And that is the only decision in this whole account that I made instantly and have never revisited. Then I checked whether the paper itself could be destroyed, which I already knew the answer to, and I checked anyway because a tired man checks things he knows. Burning it does nothing. The fuse runs on the words, not on the paper, and the words exist whether or not the sheet does. Oda burned a page in a candle in front of me once, 4 months earlier, to prove exactly this. So we had 6 days, and the whole service knew by the second morning because I read it out at the counter myself, under Rule 1 with about 40 people in the room. Somebody in the queue that morning asked whether we were all going to be struck dead. I said no. I said the box has never done anything to anybody. It takes material, and it puts it where the words say. That is what frightened me, and that is what I could not explain to a room. There is no lightning in this. The question was what the world uses as material when a sentence says that the office of just judgment has not been answering. 6 days of the wrong solutions, and I am going to put them all down, because the ballads have me arriving at the answer in a single night with my eyes shining. A reader from Belhurst proposed reading it in fragments, a line at a time on separate days, so that no complete sentence ever reached the box. I said then it happens in fragments, and we do not get to choose which fragments. Perrin Lowe proposed taking the box out to sea. I like that one. It fails for the reason everything fails, which is that the fuse runs on the words, and the words are in the world. Hald Prim wrote to me. He had been keeping a school for clerks in the South Quarter since the winter, and he had not spoken to me since he carried 9 answers in the rain. He wrote 3 pages. The last line of it is the only one I kept, and it said, "You cannot beat this with a trick, because your whole authority is that you have never once used a trick." Somebody, on the 4th evening, proposed writing a complaint about the box to the box, and was thanked sincerely for the contribution, and it broke a bad hour in a good way. Then on the 5th morning, I stopped looking for a way out and went back to the oldest thing in my trade, which is what I should have done on the first night. A petition answered is a petition in progress. 9 words in a 400-year-old practice book about how a receiving clerk marks a docket. We had used it for 91 papers about grain. Nobody had ever used it for a grievance against the Office of Judgment itself, because nobody in 400 years had ever had one on a counter with a fuse running. An answer must be true, specific, delivered to the petitioner in person, and it must say what will be done. That is the form, and those are the 4 things. So the question stopped being, how do I stop this from happening, and became, what is the true answer to Nessa Quill's grievance? And there is one. There is a true answer to it, and it took me 5 days to see and about 4 minutes to write once I had seen it, and it is not clever at all. Her grievance is that a wrong was seen and nobody answered it. What you owe a grievance like that is an answer, not a punishment, not a defense, not a judgment. An answer in writing with an inventory. So I wrote out the whole matter of Tobin Quill in the form of a chancery answer to a petition on the 5th day and most of the 6th night. Item 1. On the 6th of the month, the complaint of the mothers of Chandler Street was received, and it was true, and the physician had used water from the wrong barrel. Item 4. The complaint was read alone, at 4 minutes past 3 in the morning, by the keeper, with 5 days remaining on the fuse, and no necessity whatever. Item 5. The keeper did not ask Rule 2, which is his own services rule, written by Bettany Crow and signed by 8 people, including himself. Item 7. The license of Wilm Kobe was revoked, and with it the parish keys, and the covered catchment behind the old chapel was locked for 9 days. Item 8. 309 people in the wool sheds drank from the shed cistern for 4 days. 4 of them died. Their names are entered below in the order of their burials. Item 9. The last of those 4 was Tobin Quill, aged 9, of Tannery Row, who 11 days earlier had carried the payment book out of a smoking room because he had been told that every line matters. Item 11. The keeper carried water in leather buckets for 4 days at about 1 part in 5 of what was needed, which changed nothing and was not enough, and is recorded here because it was done and not because it helps. Item 14. What is now done. The catchment is entered on the parish record and Wilm Kobe is its keeper by name. The barracks are supplied from the Fenner pump under a standing order. Rule 2 is painted a foot high over the counter where the keeper works. Item 15. What is not done and cannot be. The boy is not returned. No material in this kingdom is his equal, and none will be offered as though it were. It is the only entry in that book that does not balance. Then the last line of an answer, which is the same on every answer any reader has ever written, and which is the reason the form exists. Here is the name of the person who will answer to you if this is not true. I signed it Emmerich Vane, reader, and Tam Wick countersigned it, and Bettany Crow countersigned it, and we did that at about 4 in the small hours on the 6th day. Then I took it to her before I took it anywhere else, and I want that order remembered because it is the whole of what I know. The petitioner is served first, not the court, not the crown, not the crowd in the street, the person who wrote the grievance at their own door before anybody else has heard a word of it. I walked to Tannery Row at 6 in the morning of the 7th day with the answer in a satchel, and I did not get there without being stopped. There were about 200 people on Fenner Street by then, because the entire city knew what was in that box and what hour the fuse ran out, and not all of them were friendly. A man came out of the crowd at the corner of Cutter Row with a stone in his hand, and he threw it from about 4 paces, and it opened my eyebrow on the same side as the slate. His name is Bran Farrow, and he lost the roof of his workshop in the 2nd week of the 91, and he had a boy of his own in the sheds who lived and who has never been right since. He was not wrong to be angry. He was wrong to throw the stone, and he knew that about a second after he did it, and he stood there waiting to be arrested by somebody. I got up and I did the only thing I have. I took a form out of the satchel and gave it to him, and I said write it with the 3 questions and bring it to the counter and it will be read in its turn. Then I asked him to spell his surname twice, because I was bleeding into my eye and I did not trust myself to have it right, and I entered his claim on the spot at the side of the road. He is on the roll now. He has been a reader in the South Quarter for 2 years, and he is better at the doors than I ever was, and he has never once mentioned the stone, and neither have I. Nessa opened the door herself, and she looked at my face and said, "You are bleeding on it." And I said, "Not on the answer, only on the satchel," and she let me in. Their kitchen had 2 chairs. She sat in one, and I did not sit in the other because it was his, and she did not ask me to. I read it to her out loud, all 15 items, in order, with the names, in the flat voice I use for dockets, and it took the better part of 20 minutes, and she did not interrupt once. When I got to item 9, which is his name and his age and what he had been doing 11 days before he died, she put her hand flat on the table and left it there for the rest of it. At the end, she said what I did not expect, and that broke me more thoroughly than the stone had. She said, "You brought it to me before the king." I said, "You are the petitioner." That is the order it goes in, and it has been the order since a girl of 12 wrote 4 lines about a well, and I walked to her door at night. She did not forgive me, and that is written down here plainly. She has never once said that she forgave me, and not once have I asked her to, and we have worked in the same room for 2 years since. What she said was, "I accept the answer." Then she said the rest of it in the same flat voice she has used since she was 12. And I want to be there when it is read. The cat had moved in with them by then. He would not look at me at all, which I record as the fairest judgment I received in the whole of that year. At noon at the end of the 7th day, in 20 towns, 212 readers read the same 4 lines out loud at the same hour, with the answer read immediately after them, and a copy of the answer nailed at every counter. We did it that way because a grievance against the office of judgment is not the property of one reading room, and because if it was going to take something, I was not going to have it take one district. Nessa Quill stood beside me at the Fenner Street counter and read the first line herself. I read the second and the third. Tam read the fourth. Then Bettany Crow read the answer. The warden saw and did not answer, And that is not just 212 voices in 20 towns, on the hour, in a kingdom that had gone quiet to listen to it. I had expected the sky to do something. Every person in that street had expected the sky to do something. What actually happened took about 9 seconds and made no sound at all. The Chancery seal, which had stood in its press in the Great Hall of the Chancery for 211 years, went to dust in the press. Not the building, not the hall, the seal, the matrix and the counter-matrix. The thing that turned wax into permission and permission into a right of petition, and the 11 duplicates of it in the district offices went with it in the same 9 seconds. And on the empty top of the box in front of us, in the wood, in the same hand as every docket ever kept in that chancery, the executed text came up, and I read it out loud because that is my job. The office of answering falls to those who read. 8 words, cut into the wood of a rotted lid, next to a black scar the shape of my own thumb. And that was the whole of it. That is what a true complaint against the God of just judgment does. It does not strike him down, and it does not put him on trial, because a grievance is not a war. It moves the duty. If the office of judgment has been seen not to answer, then the answering passes to whoever is actually answering. And on that day in this kingdom that was 212 people at 20 counters. The material it took was the seal, because the seal was the thing that had made the right to be heard into a possession. And the box has never once taken anything that was not the nearest suitable material to the sentence. I laughed. I record that as well, because it was not a dignified sound, and about 400 people heard me do it. 10 months of my life, and the invoice came out of the Chancery's own wax. Then I entered it in the payment book, because my hands do that, and Nessa took the pen off me and wrote the entry herself, and her handwriting is on that page, and mine is not. 1 Chancery seal, and 11 duplicates, taken in payment for the answering of the petition of Nessa Quill of Tannery Row, in the matter of Tobin Quill, age 9. The charter had to be rewritten within the hour, because a charter that requires a seal on a petition is a charter that requires an object which no longer exists in this kingdom. They did it that afternoon in the room behind the bench, and this time they sent for me instead of allowing me to sit at the table, which is a small difference and not a small difference. No seal shall be required of any petitioner, and the signature of a reader shall stand in its place. That is the clause, and it is what all of this was for. That is the sentence. It is what all of it was for, and it is 18 words, and it took a well, a bridge, a pig, a warehouse row, my father's house, and a boy of 9. I proofread it before the king signed it, because they asked me to, and I found one error. The word grievance was spelled with an extra letter in the 3rd clause. I marked it, and the clerk fixed it and initialed the correction. And that is the version that went into the vault, and the clerk read it back to me twice before it went to the press. Then a man in worn finery joined the petition queue at the Fenner Street counter, and stood in it for about 40 minutes, and did not push in front of anybody. Gethin Dask had lost the Blade of Embers to a moneylender in the spring. He had lost the Osley patronage when the estate went to the tenants' committee, and he had no post and no land and a debt he could not carry. His complaint was against a lender who had taken a relic worth 11 times the loan and sold it, which is true, and that is the kind of thing that box was made for. He got to the counter and he looked at me, and I looked at him, and neither of us said anything about a haul or a burned hand or an apple core. He put the blank form on the counter and turned it round so that it faced me, and then he said the only thing he could say, "I do not know how to start it." And I said the 3 questions, in the order I have said them about 4,000 times, in a village square and in 20 district clinics and at that counter every working day. What broke? How you measure it? What may be taken to pay for putting it right? 3 questions off a trestle table in a village square in the wind. He wrote it himself, in his own hand, at the standing desk by the door, like everybody else. It took him about an hour, and his handwriting is genuinely worse than Tam's. I did not gloat. I am putting that here at the end because it is the only piece of advice in this account that is worth anything to anybody. The face slap is not the day your enemy is ruined. It is the day the thing you were laughed at for becomes so ordinary that he uses it without noticing, in a queue, on a Tuesday, and is served properly by a clerk who does not make him wait. Nessa Quill was sworn onto the roll at 13, which is younger than the rules allow, and the rules were amended by the 8 names on the sheet and not by the crown, which is how our rules change. Her first paper was a woman on Cobb Lane, whose landlord had taken a door off its hinges to force her out, and it was true, and it named the landlord's own yard gate as the place of payment. She stood at the counter with it, and she said the 2 rules out loud before she read it, the way we all do, the way she had heard me say them since she was 12 years old. Read it aloud first. Then ask who else eats from the man you are about to break. She said, both of them looking at the wall where the second one is painted. The door went back on its hinges at about 4 in the afternoon, and the gate came off, and a woman on Cobb Lane slept behind a closed door that night, and it cost a landlord 1 gate, and it is in the book. 411 papers that week. 212 readers, 20 towns, the costs charged upon the declared fund, and the payment book open on the counter for anybody who walks in. Tatter sleeps in the box now. It is empty every night by the last reading, and he gets in and turns round twice, and settles, and under Rule 5 that is entirely legal, because the rule is no cat on the queue. Last thing. 3 days after the charter, at the bottom of the empty box, there was one paper that nobody had put through the slot and that none of the readers had ever seen. Good paper. Folded twice, written in a hand I do not know, in a language that is not Verland's, and not any language in the register, in letters that run the wrong way across the page. It is dated, and I can read the date because numbers are numbers in every hand there has ever been. The date on it is 4 days from now.
A box that grants any true complaint sounds like justice until you learn what it costs. Every fix in this account was paid for out of somebody's yard, roof, barn, or house. And the only honest thing anybody did was write down whose. Emmerich Vane was not remarkable because he held a relic. He was remarkable because he read the sentence aloud before granting it, asked who else would suffer for it, kept the receipt where anybody could see it, and put his own house on the page when the bill reached him. Power that keeps no ledger is not justice, whoever holds it.